Chapter 7 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Mr. Robert Hartmann comes to Inzersdorf. The great brick factory, the chief reason for existence of the little village of Inzersdorf, lay about half an hour distant by foot from the official center of the town. Near the factory was the large and attractive dwelling house in which Richard Plön, general manager of the works, lived with his family. Tall, heavy-foliaged trees and wide stretches of lawn separated the comfortable home from its utilitarian but unattractive surroundings. The main high road leading to the south lay along one side of the garden. On this road, in front of the main entrance to the manager's garden, a well-appointed carriage halted one rainy evening. A young man who sat beside the coachman on the box sprang out and rang the bell at the gate. The servant who opened bowed deeply before the gentleman in the wagon. "Too bad you should come in such weather, sir," he said. "Shall I take your trunk?" "Please do. And Carl, you take the handbags. No, leave me the umbrella myself." Following the two servants up the path through the heavy rain, the stranger entered the main door of the house, greeted most cordially by Manager Plön. "I am Manager Plön," said the latter. "Welcome to my home." "My name is Hartmann, Robert Hartmann," answered the elderly gentleman who had just arrived. "I hope sincerely that my coming will not cause any inconvenience in your household, and that you will not be angry with the Baron because he sends me to you." "No, indeed," said Plön. "You do us a great favor by coming, for I assure you it is dreary enough in Inzersdorf sometimes." "But you must know that I have the reputation of being an original." "Oh, I'm not afraid of that," laughed the manager. "We have 2 or 3 other originals in our family already. But now tell me, would you rather be domiciled downstairs or up one flight? There are 2 rooms at your service in either story, and we can easily take care of your valet also." "May I be quite frank?" "Please do." "The Baron told me something about a pavilion in your garden." "Yes, there is such a one, but it's quite a distance from the house, and if you want to have your man with you there, it would give you only 1 room for yourself." "I don't mind that, and I'm used to living alone." "Then I will have them put the pavilion in order for you." "You go and help them, Carl," said Mr. Hartmann to his servant. "It will be damp and cold in the pavilion," continued Plön. "They will have to air the rooms and heat them thoroughly. Won't you join us in the sitting-room until the place is ready? And you're sure that you will not be afraid to sleep there? The pavilion is in a distant corner of the garden, right by the wall beyond which is the open moor, and our neighborhood, I am sorry to say, is not a safe one." "I am not afraid. I am strong and well, and am not unarmed. Besides, I am not alone if I have my man with me." Mr. Plön gave orders to have the pavilion put in readiness, and then asked his guest to follow him into the sitting-room. An hour later the stranger was the center of attraction in the family circle. Plön's little boy rode fearlessly on his knee, while Mimi, a year older, tugged at his coat with perfect confidence and begged for another lovely story. The great St. Bernard dog sat beside Hartmann, looking at him with cordial interest, and the 3 grown members of the family, Manager Plön and his wife, as well as his sister, Miss Suzanne, had already decided that the advent of this stranger into their midst was as pleasant a thing as could have happened to them, for they found Hartmann a highly cultivated, delightful conversationalist, who bade fair to be an entertaining addition to the small social circle of the neighborhood. The stranger, Robert Hartmann as he called himself, a landed proprietor from Poland, had discovered brick clay on his estate and determined to start a brick factory. But as he knew nothing whatever about this industry, he concluded that it would be well to study it up first. His friend, Baron von Stein, in Vienna, had suggested to Hartmann that he might live in Inzersdorf for 2 or 3 weeks and study the brick-making there. The Baron wrote to the manager about this, and the latter had at once invited his employer's friend to be his guest for an indefinite length of time. The Baron had hinted that any courtesy offered to Hartmann would be considered as a favor to himself, and Plön was only too glad to oblige his chief. The servants had been told to make everything as comfortable as possible for him, and the family were now greatly pleased to find their unknown guest so delightful a person. About an hour after Hartmann's arrival, the pavilion was ready for him, and his host accompanied him through the garden. The little house itself was a comfortable structure built of bricks, raised up on a foundation of the height of half a story, and containing 1 large room and 1 smaller one. The windows were protected by iron bars, and the door was a heavy one ornamented with iron. The rooms were comfortably, even handsomely furnished, for the Plones used it for extra guests who came unexpectedly when the main house was full. "Why, how pretty this is!" exclaimed Hartmann as he opened the door of the main room. The heavy curtains shut out the storm, and the bright fire, as well as the shaded electrics, gave an inviting glow of warmth and light. Hartmann looked about him with great pleasure and set about making himself comfortable after having promised his host to return to the house punctually at 7 o'clock for the evening meal. When left alone with his servant, the guest opened each of the windows in turn, examining the lay of the land outside. Then he helped the valet dispose of the contents of his trunks and bags, and finally lay down on the sofa and lit himself a pipe. At the stroke of 7 he was again in the main house, and found 4 other guests there beside himself. 2 of the 3 other men were introduced to him as officials of the factory, Gebhardt the cashier, and Bauer the head bookkeeper. The 3rd guest was named by Plon as Dr. Maximoff, my future brother-in-law. With Maximoff, who was a tall, fine-looking Russian, was a charming little girl of 5 years old, his daughter. As they sat at table, Hartmann, apparently engaged in doing all justice to the abundant repast, was the while looking carefully around him and taking stock of the others of the party. Instinctively from the first, he took a dislike to Bauer, the bookkeeper. He chided himself inwardly for this, saying that the poor man could not help his unattractive appearance, his coarse, irregular features, immense mouth, and ugly yellow teeth. Nor was he probably altogether to blame for his very clumsy and awkward manners. But there was something in the man's expression, a shifty look to the pale eyes, which glanced about him nervously from time to time, that particularly antagonized the stranger. Gebhardt, the cashier, was merely a commonplace type, whereas Dr. Maximoff was in every way a noticeable personality, a complete contrast to the unfortunate bookkeeper. The Russian, apparently about 40 years of age, was a superbly built man whose strength was combined with a quiet dignity and an easy grace of movement that was most attractive. He was an excellent talker, bright and cheerful, his handsome face lighting up with frank, smiling animation at every subject that interested him. Yet in repose there was a deep melancholy in his great eyes that gave an added charm to the man's personality. Hartmann quite understood the affection with which Miss Suzanne Plon, otherwise a calm and self-possessed young lady, glanced up now and then at her betrothed. The meal progressed comfortably, and when it was over, the company adjourned to the cozy living-room. The gentlemen had just started out on an animated political discussion when the maidservant entered the room with an appearance of haste and excitement. "What's the matter?" asked Plon, who saw the girl first. "There's something happened, sir. There's been a fight, and one of the workmen is badly hurt. The constable's there already," replied the maid. Plon left the room hastily, followed by his 2 employees. Maximoff went with them. Hartmann sat quietly with the ladies, although they both looked at him somewhat in surprise. But they were quite satisfied that he made no move to follow the others, as they did not enjoy being left alone. The sudden disturbance naturally made a break in the conversation. The guest broke an uneasy little pause by asking if these fights were customary among the workmen in the factory. "Yes, unfortunately they are," sighed Mrs. Plon. "Particularly on Saturdays," put in Suzanne. "When they get their money and gather in the saloon, there's sure to be trouble. But I suppose it's so everywhere in these big establishments." "Yes, that's true," added Mrs. Plon. "Only our particular misfortune is that among our men there must be a monster of quite particular and unusual wickedness." Hartmann looked up with great interest. "Must be, you say?" he asked. "Why so definite?" "Why, I don't know," said the lady. "I suppose I might have spoken quite definitely, for we know that he is here, only no one has ever seen him, at least not to know it. His existence, however, is too unfortunately an evident fact." "Anna," said her sister-in-law, "I think I'd better take the children up to the nursery." Mrs. Plon nodded, and Suzanne led the 3 little ones away. Hartmann waited for their departure with impatience. "Do tell me, dear madam, what do you mean by this? It is most interesting. What has happened here, and why are any of your workmen suspected of whatever deed it is you are thinking of?" "It began about 3 years ago in the autumn," said Mrs. Plon. "They found the body of an old peddler in one of our shallow ponds. He had not been drowned, but had been strangled before being thrown into the water. The cord, which had pressed his life out, was still around his throat. It was a bit of black cord of an unusual sort." "And the criminal or criminals were not discovered?" "No, the murderer, we are quite certain there was only one, has not been discovered even yet." Was there any motive that one could find out? An act of personal revenge? Or was it robbery? Even the peddler's little pack can sometimes excite cupidity. Oh no, the man was a poor old soul who hadn't an enemy in the world, and his pack was found untouched beside the pond. And then what else? Oh, there were other cases. Other murders? No, minor crimes. For instance? An empty house was broken into, a private house belonging to people who came here for the summer. Was there much taken from the house? There was nothing taken at all. Then the criminal or criminals were frightened away? No, no one saw the man. You're quite sure there was only one? Yes, there was only one. That was proved by the tracks in the snow. Our constable happened to pass the house the next morning and saw footprints in the deep snow leading from the street up to the empty house. And then? The official followed these tracks up to the house, stepping carefully beside them. The tracks, he said, were of unusual size. The house has only a small garden and is surrounded by a high iron railing. The constable noticed that the house door and all the windows were opened. There was no smoke from the chimneys, but the constable thought it possible that someone might have come merely to air the house and to look about inside, so he rang the bell. There was no answer even to his repeated ringing. He saw that the footprints led up to the front door, and that other tracks led out again from the door and around to the back of the house. The policeman followed these tracks back to the end of the garden and saw that there were several boards broken out of the fence. From there the tracks led into the grove beyond. Our worthy constable went around to the front of the house again, and hailing a passerby, sent him to the police station with news of the occurrence. He himself waited in front of the house until the police commission came, and then they all entered together. The house was empty, and there was no sign of damage done within. In one particular only was there any trace of an outsider's presence there. The lock of the sideboard was broken open, and a bottle of expensive wine taken out. This, 2/3 empty, with a used glass, were on top of the sideboard. A cigar box was open and one of the cigars missing. A little heap of ashes on the sideboard showed that the intruder had been smoking there. But where do you think that half a cigar was found? I haven't an idea. No, nobody could imagine it that hadn't heard of it. The rest of the cigar was found in the mouth of a snowman, which was built up in the yard at the back of the house, a remarkably well-modeled figure. What a delightful idea! Yes, the owner of the house thought so too, as he is a man with a sense of humor. Only he did not care to run the danger of more such unexpected visitations, so he sold his house to people who would live in it year-round. The whole performance was astonishingly impudent, to say the least. But that isn't all, Mrs. Plone. I can see by your face that you're keeping back the most interesting morsel for the last. Your guess is correct, Mr. Hartmann. And may I not know what it is? I'm waiting for you to ask how it was we knew that this impudent trick was played by the murderer of the poor old peddler. Please imagine the question asked. I'm very curious as to the answer. The originator of this trick had left something else on the snowman besides the cigar. And what was that? A black cord. Oh, that is interesting. Mr. Hartmann straightened up in his chair and looked out into space, his gray eyes brilliantly keen. I thought you would be surprised. It certainly is a piece of astonishing cynicism, this leaving the black cord around the neck of the innocent snowman in the very same manner that it was found about the neck of the unfortunate peddler, said Mrs. Plone. Hartmann passed his hand over his forehead. In this case, it took the place of a visiting card. His voice had a peculiarly hard tone as he spoke. Yes, of course, there was no other reason for it this time, but it's strange this unknown monster should have been so ready to let us know that he was still in the neighborhood after such a murder. Yes, that was quite unnecessary, wasn't it? Put in Miss Suzanne, who had just returned. Did you tell Mr. Hartmann about the attack on the cattle dealer? No, I left that for you. That happened since you've been here. Oh, then Miss Plone hasn't lived here always? Asked the guest with polite interest. No, I've only been here since my mother's death, which happened about a year ago, and this other incident occurred just after my arrival. Then you tell Mr. Hartmann about it, laughed Mrs. Plone. That is, if you're sure you will not feel creepy when you get back to your lonely abode, she added, turning to her guest, for it happened just outside our wall, about opposite the pavilion. That makes it all the more interesting, said Hartmann with a smile, which cloaked the tense lines of his face. Now I really must hear the story. You may have noticed that a lane goes out past our wall at the end of the garden. It goes through a sort of cut right there, for the ground is higher on the other side and the bushes are thick. It was just such a rainy evening as this one when a cattle dealer of Inzersdorf walked past here alone on his way to the more distant of our 2 railway stations. It was a rather thoughtless thing for the man to do, for he was known to have made a big deal at the market that day, and might suppose, therefore, to have considerable money with him. As he approached the cut in the lane, the cattle dealer had the feeling that someone was following him on the other side of the bushes. He stopped and listened. It was already too dark to see anything. He thought he saw a figure behind the bushes, but when he went over to look, it was gone. The man took his revolver in his hand and went on his way. Suddenly, his hat was torn from his head, and something struck his face like a whiplash, drawing a long cut in his cheek. The dealer shouted and fired his revolver in the air. With the other hand he caught at the thing, whatever it was, that was on his face. He only just caught it lightly, something that seemed to him like a thin cord with sharp edges. Then it was torn from his hand, and he saw a figure disappear into the woods. He shot again in that direction, but had no means of knowing whether the bullet took effect. Everything was quiet after that, but the cattle dealer returned to Inzersdorf police station and told what had happened to him. Next morning, the ground around the spot was examined. Was anything found? Nothing but a number of footprints in the rain-soaked ground. Footprints of unusual size. All footprints seem large in rain-soaked earth, remarked Hartmann. Suzanne smiled. That may be, she said, but the footprints of this lasso-thrower measured 16 inches at least, and the space between them was nearly 6 feet. The man must have fairly jumped from step to step. Yes, that's so. That was a wide stride. Particularly when you consider the condition of the ground. Which shows that the man had very long legs, great physical strength and activity, said the guest, and Suzanne added, and it shows also, doesn't it, that he must be a man in the prime of life. Quite right, Miss Plone, replied Hartmann. Your conclusion would do honor to an experienced police official. Oh, here they come, said Suzanne, rising quickly and going to meet her brother. Where is Sergius? She asked. Is he still with the injured or dead man? It was only an injury, said the manager. Maximoff has treated his wounds and will stay with him until the ambulance comes. He will join us again when he has cleaned himself up, he says. Who is the victim? He's one of the newer men. I don't think you know him. His wounds are not fatal, but they're pretty bad. Do they know who did it? There seem to be 3 of them. It was a drunken brawl, of course. Bauer, will you kindly telephone to the police station? This thing has got to stop, if I have to have the innkeeper's concession taken away. Bauer left the room, and the ladies continued to question Plone. Who are the 3 attackers? Have they been arrested yet? Asked Mrs. Plone. Yes, the constable has taken them off. The chief sinner is Lieb, who is at the bottom of everything of that kind here, and then the 2 Polish brothers with the unpronounceable name. But this is really distressing, said Hartmann. Will I have all this trouble when I start my brick factory? Plone laughed. I couldn't say in advance, he replied. There is sure to be trouble of this kind everywhere where you have a lot of workmen together, a number of them unmarried men living in barracks. But the brutality in this neighborhood seems to be worse than anywhere else, even including murders and night attacks. Oh, then the ladies have been telling you. Yes, said Mrs. Plone. The occurrence of this evening naturally suggested the subject. Well then, as long as we have started that topic, suppose our friend Gebhardt here tells us about his adventure. We must all do what we can to entertain our honored guest. Plone spoke with a laugh in his eyes. Oh, don't you make fun of us, said Suzanne quickly. You're just as much excited over all these things as we are. You won't even let us walk to Inzersdorf without protection. Didn't we have to borrow Sergius's carriage the other day because our own was being fixed, and we had to be out after dark? No, indeed, this unknown monster, as Anna calls him, worries you just as much as he does us. Who is it that worries you? Said Maximoff, entering the room just then. We were talking about the unknown criminal who must be living here among our workmen, said Mrs. Plone. But why are you so sure that the man must be one of your workmen? Asked Hartmann, and Maximoff, who took a seat beside Suzanne, added, Yes, that's true, Anna. I've often intended to ask you why you are so sure that it is one of your men. The hostess shrugged her shoulders. I really don't know why I should be so sure about it, she confessed, but the whole neighborhood seems to think so, and I fell in with the general opinion. Besides, the police authorities know every one of the permanent inhabitants of our village, and there is nobody among them who could come under suspicion. But these workmen come from nobody knows where, stay with us for a little while, and then pass on. There is no way of controlling them, or even of getting to really know them. But don't you know, said Dr. Maximoff gravely, that sometimes the most dangerous criminals can be found in the class of people whom we invite to our dinner table? Hear, hear, cut in Plone. Don't let's start a discussion. We want our guest to hear Gebhardt's story. The cashier told him how he had been attacked one evening as he was leaving the village inn rather late on his way to his own rooms, which were in the office building. The incident happened last spring, and he still carried traces of it. "You can see here," he said, pushing back his left sleeve. "Here is where some heavy, blunt instrument struck my arm. It split the bone and tore a tendon, but my assailant did not get off undamaged. Since our neighborhood has become so unsafe, I carry a leaded cane when I go out at night, and I struck out with this when the man jumped at me suddenly from behind a bush. He screamed, and I knew that I must have hurt him. I must have hit his shoulder or breast. He sprang back into the bushes, and although I tried to follow him, he had soon disappeared in the darkness. Next morning, all our men were at their posts, but of course it was impossible to have a physical examination made of over 200 working men, so that I could not tell whether any one of them was suffering from a broken rib or collarbone. However, since then I agree with Mrs. Plone that this unknown criminal must be one of our factory hands. I know that I am not a favorite with them, although I do not know why they should hate me enough to want to kill me, and yet there must be someone who feels that way towards me, someone who belongs to our establishment, for he found his way into my room the day after the attack." "He came to your room?" exclaimed Hartmann, astonished. "Yes, he came right into my room, in my absence, of course." "Then how did you know he was there?" "I knew it from something he left behind him, a noose made of an odd sort of black cord." "Oh." "You can imagine that the discovery did not please me very much. It seemed like a threat, and I have not gone out unarmed since then." "Then you are sure that your assailant was the unknown murderer?" "It looks that way." Hartmann turned to the manager. "And you haven't the faintest idea, sir, which one of your men it could be who keeps the entire neighborhood in such fear and anxiety?" "No, not the faintest idea," was the answer. "I have had a capable detective living and working among my men for 6 months now. He found that several of them were under suspicion for crimes committed elsewhere, but he found nothing that would identify the man with the black cord. But now, enough of this unpleasant subject for tonight. Do you care to join us at our usual game of cards?" The game lasted for an hour or so, then Maximov's carriage was called, and he and his little girl left the house. Hartmann bade his host good evening, and took his way down to his lonely pavilion, accompanied by the manager and a servant. Karl opened the door to receive them, and held it open to light the way for the return to the house. "Have they taken good care of you?" said Hartmann when he was left alone with his valet. "Oh yes, very nicely. They even brought my supper out here for me when I asked for it." "That's good. But from tomorrow on I have arranged with the manager that you are to eat in the factory mess room, or else in the village inn. You are to mix in with the working men and pay particular attention to men of unusual size." "Pay particular attention to big men?" "All right, sir." Karl's face showed great interest, but he did not dare to ask any further questions. "And now you can go to bed," said Hartmann, "and remember it is only you who must clean my clothes and shoes. The others must not see them at all." Karl bowed and left the room. When alone, Hartmann began to undress. When he had taken off his coat and vest and his boots, his figure was much shorter and less ample, and when he had finally laid off a costly diamond ring and a handsome scarf pin, Joseph Muller stood there in all his own unobtrusive humbleness. He slipped on a dressing gown, turned off the electric light, and parting the curtains of one of the windows, he looked out into the darkness. When his eyes had grown accustomed to the gloom, he could see the level outlines of the moor stretching away into the distance beyond the bushes on the other side of the road, and to the right a few groups of trees and some of the outbuildings of the factory completed the skyline. "What a pity," he thought. "What a great pity that I didn't hear about this man with the black cord before tonight. My 2 years in the South lost me several interesting things, but I suppose I needed the rest. No, I don't agree with my charming hostess as to the fact that this black cord man is one of the working men. The sense of humor shown in the airing of the villa and the building of the snow figure is not usual among men of that class. And then this unheard of recklessness in so impudently leaving his traces behind him from case to case. I suppose I will be able to see one of these bits of cord. Anyway, it's exceedingly interesting, and this last mystery is the most interesting of all. I wonder if there is any connection here. Nobody mentioned the Erlock case tonight, but it probably won't be difficult to get them to talk about it." At this stage in his meditation, Muller devoted his attention again to the landscape. Then he went to bed. "The idea of the black cord is really delicious, most romantic," he murmured once more before he went to sleep. "But it's too reckless. This man will hang himself with a bit of his own cord before long." End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8, Part 1 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Midnight in the greenhouse. Mr. Hartmann began his studies in the factory the very next day. The bookkeeper Bauer had been appointed his guide and showed him all the rooms in the establishment, describing the various stages of the process with considerable intelligence. The man knew his business thoroughly, and Plone had already spoken of him to his guest as a faithful and capable employee. But Bauer himself, as a man, was extremely unattractive, and the impression of distaste gained by Hartmann the evening before was increased by a further acquaintance with the bookkeeper. Bauer was tall and fairly well built. The somewhat too heavy lines of his figure gave an impression of great strength, but his repulsive face and his bad table manners were as disagreeable as was his constant inclination to bring up only unpleasant matters in his conversation. Muller wondered that the rest of the company did not seem to notice this. Then he realized that they were accustomed to it from seeing Bauer almost daily for several years. Also that they were willing to overlook the man's disagreeable qualities because of his other good traits. When the detective found a moment to talk it over with the general manager, he discovered that Bauer was one of the originals of whom Plone had spoken the evening before. "He's the most prosaic man you can imagine ordinarily," said the manager, "but I happen to have discovered that he writes poems in secret, and sends flowers to a lady whom he loves equally secretly and without any hope whatever. It is the contrast between his ordinarily prosaic nature, his complete lack of attraction, and this secret sentimentality which seems to be beyond his control, that makes him such an original. It makes him somewhat ridiculous, I must confess. I know he is not an agreeable table companion, but we overlook it because of his other good qualities, and because the poor man is so alone in the world." Muller didn't ask who the other originals were, and he was not particularly interested in the matter at the moment. The house and all those within interested him only as headquarters from which to pursue his investigations. Once Lieutenant Erlock had put him in charge of the affair, he had taken the keys of the greenhouse and had obtained from the local authorities a promise that nothing should be changed in the entire place until he wished it done. This was not the usual proceeding, but then Muller was not a usual sort of detective, and the police in and around Vienna knew that it was worth while to let him go his own way in any case he had undertaken. Everything was done that could make the investigation easier for him this time. A high police official introduced him to Baron Stein, the owner of the brick factory, and made it possible for him to enter the manager's house in the role of Robert Hartmann, the Polish landed proprietor. The Baron himself suggested his living in the pavilion because right near it there was a small door in the garden wall through which he could go in and out without being seen. He asked for the key from his host on the pretext of not disturbing the family in his comings and goings, and he soon made use of it. The day after his arrival was a Sunday. He spent the morning in the factory, and in the afternoon he went out for a solitary walk. His path led him past the greenhouse. He made a thorough examination of the avenue of trees, and followed it up in the direction in which the man seen by Stillinger had gone. The end of this short arbored road led out onto one of the two main highroads which crossed the Black Moor. It was the road known as Laxenburg Avenue, shaded by ancient trees which shed their leaves heavily in the autumn wind. It was a very ancient street, but not altogether a favorite one because of the loneliness of the country through which a greater part of its length led. At either end of this arched avenue were the royal castles Laxenburg and Schönbrunn. Did the man whom Stillinger had seen go down this avenue, or did he turn off into one of the side roads which crossed it? One of these led to the factory, another to the second high road, and a third to a mill on the river. And each of these side roads had presumably several forks. One thing only was certain. That was that the man in the fog had gone first towards the southwest. This direction would lead him, if he continued in it, past a little shallow pond surrounded by bushes, which lay between the Erlock property and Laxenburg Avenue. Muller stood on the edge of this pond, gazing down into the water. It lay so thickly hidden between its fringe of bushes that the wind scarcely ruffled its surface. The detective stood looking at the dark, silent stretch of water. Now, in case that man had been carrying Erlock, the murdered Erlock, in his arms, when he first heard the shot behind him, he may have left the body by the wayside and gone back for it later, he pondered. But he didn't put it in this pond. and again he looked down at the water plants which showed just below the surface over the entire expanse of the little pool. Then he took up a heavy stone and threw it into the water. He could see it quite clearly, and was thus certain of the shallowness of the pond. He turned away from it back to the avenue, walked down to the bridge, and then returned in the direction of the factory. He had almost reached the buildings when he heard his name called, and saw Dr. Maximoff behind him, waving his hat and hurrying to catch up. The Russian was on his way to the Plone house and carried an armful of unusually beautiful chrysanthemums. Muller's sincere admiration of the superb flowers pleased the other, so that he gave him a cordial invitation to come and see his conservatory. "It's not far from here," said the Russian. "When we pass these bushes we can catch a glimpse of my house. There, do you see that red roof behind the trees? That's where I've lived for the last 4 years. You must certainly come and see me." "I shall be very glad to. Then you've been in Austria for some time?" "Oh, I've been here before that even. I studied in Vienna, as so many of my countrymen do, and grew very fond of the neighborhood. But this particular spot of it can't have very much attraction for you, apart from Miss Suzanne," said Hartmann, smiling. The doctor answered with a sigh. "I did not know Miss Suzanne when I moved here," he said with a touch of melancholy in his voice. "I came here in the desire to get away from everything that reminded me of the short but very happy years of my first marriage. I didn't care where I went. After my wife's death, I left my own country with my little girl, went to Paris for a while, and then came to Vienna. I looked about for a country home, for my baby is not strong, and I did not want to keep her in the city. My agent found this little place here, Rose Cottage they call it. I came and looked at it. The place was pretty, and I was so indifferent to everything else that I scarcely noticed how unattractive the country about here is." "And now I suppose you notice it less than ever," remarked Hartmann good-naturedly. "Yes, indeed. Now that I have found Suzanne, we have been engaged for nearly 2 months. Now I am happy again. If only nothing happens to prevent—" "What do you fear?" "I fear that something may come between me and my happiness." "But why should you fear it?" Muller halted and looked up into the other's melancholy eyes with true sympathy. Maximoff smiled sadly. "You may not know how we Russians are constituted psychically," he said. "Either our blood is overlight or else heavy and black as the storm night. I am not of the first type, I think. I can be merry with others for a time, but I cannot shake off my natural melancholy. But really," he continued in a lighter tone, "this is selfish of me, and it can't interest you, and I see Suzanne and the children waving to us from the window. Let us hurry to greet them." "Where's your little girl?" asked Muller as they walked on more quickly. Maximoff explained that Sonia had taken a slight cold yesterday, and that he was afraid to bring her out. His face softened and his eyes shone in tenderness as he spoke of his little girl, and the soft-hearted detective felt a warm wave of sympathy for this good-looking and attractive man. The Russian seemed to reciprocate it, and the men parted at the door, apparently the best of friends. During the conversation that evening, Muller managed cleverly to bring the talk around to the topic which interested him most. And without anyone noticing his management of it, he soon had them all discussing the Urlach case. He pretended to have heard nothing whatever about it, and he showed an interest that flattered the ladies into giving him all possible detail. After he had been informed as to the disappearance of old Urlach from within his locked room, the men of the party had something to say as to the character of this eccentric elderly bachelor. They both agreed on the fact that Leopold Urlach was a totally uninteresting personality. Maximoff, who said that he occasionally went to the greenhouse to play chess with its owner, had some amusing anecdotes to tell about the pettiness of the other's outlook on life, which was oddly combined with considerable personal arrogance. "But the authorities have evidently not given up hope of bringing some light into this mystery," continued the Russian, "for our constable, whom I met this afternoon, told me that an experienced detective was expected shortly from the city to take charge of the case." "That's a good idea," said Mrs. Plone. "It struck me they were giving it up very quickly." "But when no one else has discovered anything after 2 weeks of research, I don't see how a new detective is going to help," remarked Suzanne. "No, if there was any clue to be found at first, all traces of it are probably gone by this time." "And the criminal himself has had quite sufficient time to cover all his tracks," said Hartmann, who was playing with the little boy on his knee. "I wonder," he added casually, "whether the occurrences of which you told me yesterday have any connection with this last mystery?" "Whether the man with the black cord had a hand in it, you mean?" said Plone. "It might be, but he didn't leave the cord this time, and he seems to take a pride in doing so." "There's an astounding, almost an admirable insolence in that," was Hartmann's next remark. "Then they didn't find it this time? This odd visiting card?" Maximoff laughed heartily at this designation for the black cord, and the talk turned on lighter things. The guest seemed to have very little interest in the subject and did not mention it again. Saying that he was tired, he left the company earlier than usual, reaching his own little habitation before 9 o'clock. At about 10 o'clock that night, a key was turned carefully in the great gate leading to Erlach's property. Muller entered and closed the door behind him with the same caution. Then he opened the house doors and closed them again by the light of his electric lantern. He went quickly from room to room, crossing through into the kitchen and the back hall. He examined the rear door and found it firmly closed and locked. Then he went through the rooms on the other side of the hall, back into the main corridor, out of which Erlach's bedroom and sitting room opened. His main object in this nightly visit was to examine the papers and letters in the missing man's desk, in the hope of something that would give a clue to his disappearance. When he entered the sitting room, he closed the window shutters carefully. Then he examined equally carefully the little table on which the open book and the candlestick stood. But what he saw there gave him no particular ideas, awoke no illuminating train of thought. He turned away from the table with a shake of the head and carefully locked the doors of both rooms on the inside. He smiled at himself as he did it. It seemed such an unnecessary caution in a house that was so carefully closed at its entrances, and besides, as the event that had happened there proved, there was some way of getting in and out of this room otherwise than through the doors and windows. Then Muller sat down at the desk and began to examine the bundles of letters and papers in all of its drawers. Those papers, the age of which were shown in their yellowing edges, he laid carefully back in their place. His time and his interest were given to the more recent correspondence, which was very scanty. There were a few letters from Paul Erlach, written in a formal style. Not a single letter contained a request for money, nor a word of thanks for any gift. In spite of his financial difficulties, the young officer had never asked his uncle for help, and the latter had never volunteered assistance. There were a few business letters and some bills, and 2 or 3 in a woman's hand, which were signed Eva, your grateful Eva. Aha, there is someone, and a woman at that, who has a reason to be grateful to this old egoist, thought Muller, as he read through Eva's letters. There were just 13 of them, but they told him little. This Eva was evidently a person of education, but the letters were so very formal, stiff, and cold that they threw no further light on her mentality. The contents of all were exactly alike. She wrote each time to acknowledge the receipt of some gift and to express her thanks for it. But she did not mention clearly in any letter what this gift was, and there was something forced and reluctant about her thanks. The last drawer that Muller opened contained notebooks carefully ordered, each one of them dated with the beginning and end of the period over which the memoranda extended. Muller began to read the 2 upper ones of the pile. There were figures for every day, even for the smallest expenditures. The last book contained memoranda beginning with the 1st of March and ending with the 9th of September. And on the 1st of each month, below the item noted as wages for Mrs. Tunner, came another, 20 crowns for E. The old gentleman, for some reason unknown to anyone else, had sent 20 crowns every month to this Eva, whose cool letter of thanks might mean either a cold heart or a very youthful mind unused to expressing its thoughts. Muller found this matter rather interesting, but he soon came to something that was even more so. In an older book, one which bore the dates of June 1st to the end of December of a year back, Mr. Erlach had made up a summary of his entire fortune, which was invested in stocks and bonds. Muller carried in his pocket a copy of the official list of what had been found in the safe. He took it out now and compared Erlach's own list with the one made by the police on the 10th of September. There was something wrong there, something decidedly wrong. Papers to the value of at least 20,000 crowns were missing from his safe, and in none of the notebooks of a later date was there any memoranda of the change in investment or any other disposal of the sum. And yet Erlach had written down every half-pound of butter, every bag of salt that came into his house. Muller leaned forward, resting his head in his hands, while he pondered deeply on this matter. Suddenly he started. He thought he had heard the closing of a door, and yet he realized it might have been only the creaking of a bough outside or a turn of a rusty weathercock. The detective rose softly from his seat and listened. Then he put out his left hand to catch the lantern and took his revolver with the right. There was no mistake possible now. Someone was moving in the hall. Muller had left the key in the inside of the sitting-room door, a key on a ring from which hung several others. The detective's eyes watched the flickering of light which these keys threw out in the faint gleam of his lantern. Then he moved forward slowly and listened again. Someone was moving out in the hall. It was so quiet within the heavy-walled old house that even the gentlest sound could be plainly heard. Muller had reached the study door by this time, and again he stood, listening. The corridor was about 15 yards long, 3 rooms opening on it from either side. The door to Erlach's bedroom was the center door on that side of the house. Whoever it was outside there, creeping so softly through the hall, was now standing in front of that bedroom door. A hand turned the knob. Muller took his revolver in his left hand, while with his right he quickly turned the key and swung the study door open. But the hanging bunch of keys rattled betrayingly, and he who stood outside had quick ears. As the detective pulled the door open, a tall figure glided past him towards the front of the house. "Stop right there or I'll shoot," called Muller, but the man did not stop. He flung open the front glass door and dashed down the 5 steps leading to the ground. Muller was equally quick in pursuit and fired as he ran. But the man gave no sign of having been hit and did not lessen his pace in the slightest. The sharp light of 2 electric beams threw his quick-moving shadow along the ground, for he carried a lantern also. Muller fired a second time, but just as he did so, the man ahead of him made a quick dive around the corner of the house. As Muller followed him in this direction, something hard struck him on the head and dazed him for a moment. But he was not injured and took up his pursuit in a second or two. The slight pause, however, was sufficient to enable the other to dash through the garden door and disappear in the blackness outside. End of Chapter 8, Part 1. Chapter 8, Part 2 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Midnight in the Greenhouse, continued. The detective stood by the gate peering out in all directions, but the night was absolutely dark, and the blackness was impenetrable beyond the ray of his lantern. He closed the door with the key which he found on the outside, and then put it in his pocket. On his way back to the house he found the object that had hit him on the head. It was a little lantern of unusually fine and costly workmanship. He took this in too. Both the front doors had been unlocked from the outside. The keys were still in the locks. Muller closed them and put both keys with the others in his pocket. Then he let the light of his own lantern move over every foot of the floor of the corridor. He saw several new footprints there, the wet earth still clinging to some of them. He recognized his own footprints, and beside them were enormous tracks that he had not seen there before. Muller drew a deep breath. His eyes shone with the gleam that came into them when he was on the trail. But he did not stay in the hall. He went back into the study, locked it carefully, and from there passed on into the bedroom. The first thing he did here was to fasten a tablecloth up over one window and a bedspread over the other. He was not at all anxious that anybody from outside should see him through a possible crack in the shutters, for he knew that his life wasn't worth much after what had happened, and then besides he wished to be left to work undisturbed. He took his seat on a comfortable armchair near the door that led to the corridor, and pulled a little flask from his pocket. After a hearty drink, he rubbed a lump that was growing on his head, and then lit a cigar. Then finally he disposed himself to meditate over this unexpected night visitor. "Who could it have been?" he said. "Could it have been the same person who underscored those 3 words in the book, in the next room there?" Those words, "he was here," had not seemed to mean anything to the local authorities, and Muller himself had been unable to find no fitting explanation for them until he heard the story of the man with the black cord. Even then it meant no clue which led to anything. Who had underscored these words? Erlach himself when he saw his life threatened? Or his murderer? But why should Erlach do such a thing? The incident had no sense to it unless it had been written by the other, for this other might have intended this to notify the authorities, who were so unable to cope with him, that he was the terrible unknown who kept them all in fear and terror for years, that he had been in this room and had given them another uncanny riddle to solve. Who was it who was here a few moments back? Muller asked himself again and again. It was not Leopold Erlach, of that he was certain. Leopold Erlach was small and slight, and this man was of unusual size. A man may increase his height and his breadth by a disguise, but he cannot change the length of his stride. No man under middle height could take the steps left as a clear trail by the fleeing unknown, and no old man could move with such haste. It had not been Leopold Erlach, even if the latter were still alive. Of course, it may have been an ordinary thief who managed to get the 3 keys and thought this a good chance to plunder an empty house, said the detective to himself, but this idea didn't seem right to him. He was glad he had forgotten to bar the garden door through which he entered himself. For if this had been done, the unknown would have realized that there was someone in the house and would not have come. The man, whoever it was, seemed to know the locality and went directly to the bedroom. What could he want in this room? He must know that all valuables, as well as the contents of the safe, had been removed to the police courts. Was there some clue, some trace of his presence that he may have remembered leaving and that he wanted to take away? The detective asked himself all these questions while his eyes wandered slowly over every inch of the room. He knew that the bedchamber had been thoroughly examined by the local police several times. Every inch of the wall and floor had been sounded, the larger pictures and the mirror had been taken from the walls in search of a possible secret door. The bed had been dragged out from the wall, but had not otherwise been disturbed. It was impossible that Erlach could be concealed in the bed anywhere, for although the wooden part of the structure was very old, the spring and mattress were new and modern. On Muller's first visit to the house, he had also examined the room very carefully, but he had not seen anything beyond what the others had found. He knew now, however, that there was something more to be seen, something which he must find, something which brought this nightly visitor to the door. Suddenly the veteran detective rose with a start, while a crimson wave of blood shot up over his face to the very roots of his hair. One of his sudden intuitive flashes had illumined his brain. He had realized that all the colors in this room were dark. From the browns of the inlaid floor up to the paler ceiling, everything was dark. The furniture was of ebony, and the picture frames heavily carved, of the same wood. The wallpaper was of a dark shade which had grown deeper with years. The light ceiling and the white coverings of the bed were all that brought brightness into the room. Muller's eyes now rested on the old-fashioned woodwork of the bed structure, its richly carved high head and footboards. On top of the headboard, 2 little angels, carved out of the black wood, leaned forward as if to look down on the one who should sleep there. With their little fat fingers they held fast to a rococo railing which formed a border for the heavier carving of the solid wood below. It was this railing and its many corners and curves that now attracted Muller's eyes. A faint memory of something seen before, but only half noticed, came back to his mind. It seemed to him that when he first saw this bed he had casually noticed that the lines of the pretty composition at its top were not quite clear. It was this memory that now sent a searchlight flash through his brain. He stood with the light of his lantern thrown full on the carving, and his tightly closed lips parted in a smile. His free hand carefully disengaged the black cord which was twisted about the black carving, the cord left there by an incredibly audacious criminal. Then Muller examined his latest discovery. The cord was about 10 inches long, evidently a bit cut off of a larger piece. The strands were loosening on either end. The cord was made of braided horsehair and was about as heavy as a large steel knitting needle. "That's what he was after," said Muller aloud, and then he wondered mildly whether the man who escaped was not likely to be waiting outside on the moor until he himself should come out. If he were, there would probably be heard the sound of a shot through the night, or, safer still, the quick thrust of a knife, and the man with the black cord would no longer have to fear the only foe who was as brave and as clever as he was himself. But Muller, who though fearless, was not reckless, decided that there was no necessity of running into such unavoidable danger when he could easily pass the rest of the night in the greenhouse. He looked at his watch and found it to be just 12 o'clock. Having nothing else to do, the detective turned to another examination of the bed. The first time he had seen it, on the 20th of September, he was already convinced that that bed had not been slept in on the night of the 9th. But he knew that someone had laid down on it for a few moments, laid down in his clothes and his shoes. He discovered this through the magnifying glass with which he had thoroughly examined the sheets and the coverings. The glass showed him infinitesimal bits of earth on the white surface, and these soiled spots were very near the front of the bed, at the place where the coverlet had been found thrown back. Muller was sure that somebody had lain on that bed with his knees drawn up, and that the soles of his boots had come into contact with the clean sheet. Whoever it was had been careful to brush away all the stains, except the few microscopic bits which no one had noticed. The top pillow still held the pressure of a head, and the sheets showed the folds into which they were thrown by the body resting there. But at the lower end of the bed there was not a single fold to be seen. Whoever had lain there had not stretched himself out comfortably as a man naturally would when sleeping in his accustomed bed. Why had the unknown criminal desired to give the bed the appearance of having been slept in? For no other reason possibly than simply to give an added touch of mystery to the affair. And all of the clothes which Ehrlich had worn through the day of the 9th of September were missing. Muller knew by this time that the old man had not yet gone to bed when he was attacked. This corresponded with Karl Tunner's report that he had seen a light in Ehrlich's room when he had entered the garden. The lamp hung above the desk in the study, and the study shutters were not closed, so that the light could easily be seen from outside. While pondering all this, Muller made himself comfortable in the corner of a big sofa, settling down for the rest of the night. But he had not sat there long before he raised his head again and listened. Again he heard someone moving, outside the house this time. He stood up, closed his lantern, took his revolver, and moved softly out into the corridor. When he reached the front door, he looked out through the glass and could dimly see the figure of a man waiting there. The man moved, pressed the knob of the outer iron gate, and shook it. Finding this of no avail, he put his arm through the bars and knocked on the glass pane. Then Muller knew who it was, and turned the light of his lantern full on the face outside as he opened the door. "What are you doing here?" he asked in surprise, as Karl Tunner slipped hastily through the opening. "Thank goodness you're all right," murmured Karl, wiping his face. "I thought sure he'd shot you." "Who had?" "The man I met as I ran up here." "Where did you meet him?" "About 100 paces outside the gate, at the end of the avenue. He suddenly jumped out from behind a tree and ran off over the moor." "Did you call after him?" "Yes. 'Stop, you rascal!' I cried. You see, I heard the shots and saw him running away." "Did you climb over the wall again?" asked Muller when they were back in the bedroom and he was gathering up the trophies of his evening's work. Karl nodded an affirmative. "You didn't call my name, did you?" "Oh, no." "Well, we can go now. Even if he should come back, he won't dare to attack two of us." Muller locked the front doors carefully, thinking that the unknown would not be able to get into the house again, as it was scarcely possible he would have duplicate keys. Then the detective opened his lantern and let it move over the ground in front of the door and up the path. There were a number of tracks to be seen in the soft earth. Muller recognized his own footprints and Karl's, and beside them the traces of an enormous foot at astonishingly wide intervals. He stooped to examine one of them. It was a very odd track, having none of the usual outlines of a boot sole. It was just one big, even oblong, rounded off a little at either end. "He's wearing overshoes," said the detective. "Not rubber soles, either, for these have very characteristic soles and can be recognized at once. This man is much too clever for that. He chooses felt slippers or something of that sort. It's a very good idea, an excellent idea, one reason the less to fear discovery." Muller straightened up and put out his light even before they came to the corner of the house. "Now watch out well," he said in a whisper to Karl, "and stay close beside me. Take this leaded cane, and if we should be attacked, and you can get at him, try to hit his legs. But don't make a mistake and hit mine instead." Then they went forward through the blackness. But the eye grows accustomed even to such darkness, and when Muller had locked the garden gate behind him, he could already distinguish the outlines of tall old trees. Once outside, the two men set out on a strange wandering about the moor, going now to the right, now to the left, then back again, stopping now to listen, creeping forward again. Finally, after numerous twistings and turnings and zigzaggings, they came back to the little gate that led them into the garden of their present home. Before Karl opened this gate, they both listened and looked in all directions. Then, when they were quite certain that there was no one within sight or hearing, they slipped quickly through and into the pavilion. They went to bed in the darkness, for if anyone outside on the moors should have been following or watching their wandering, it would not be wise to let him see light at that hour in the little house inhabited by Mr. Hartmann and his valet. Muller lay awake for some time, going over all the impressions he had received during this eventful night. Of one thing he was certain, a certainty which thrilled him with pleasurable excitement. He knew now that the person concerned in the Ehrlich mystery was the same clever, cynical, reckless rascal who had kept the entire neighborhood in terror for the last 3 years. And Muller was certain of something else, too. The unknown was not one of the factory workers. The peculiar style and evident costliness of the little lantern that had come into his possession in so unpleasant a manner was a proof that the man who had thrown it at him did not belong to the working class. And as the unknown, fleeing before him, had opened the front door of the house, the light of Muller's lantern fell on his hand. All the detective could see was that the hand was covered by a glove of soft, reddish-brown leather. He could get no correct impression as to the size or structure of the hand itself. Anyway, it's not the custom among factory workers to wear kid gloves. In fact, it's not a usual thing for criminals accustomed to such nightly excursions to wear gloves anyway, said Muller to himself. Then suddenly he sat up in bed. Although he was already growing old, the veteran detective was young in heart and spirit, and he never lost acuteness of the shock when one of his flashing thoughts came to him. This was one. Does this superintelligent, this quite extraordinarily clever villain always wear gloves when he is doing something, whereby the impression of the skin of his fingers might leave a fatal clue? He must be familiar with criminal proceedings, and know how important that point is. But in spite of his sleepless night, Muller was up early the next morning. Karl was awake still earlier, and stood ready with the heavy wadded vest and coat which gave his slender employer Mr. Hartmann's comfortable avoirdupois. When Muller had finished dressing, he said to Karl, "You know what you are to do today?" Tanner bowed. "Yes, Mr. Muller." "Mr. Muller?" repeated the detective sharply. "Mr. Hartmann, sir," the young man answered with a smile. Muller's glance was still sharp. "My dear young man, it is no laughing matter that we are engaged on here. You may have noticed that last night, when you proved yourself worthy of my confidence. Both you and I must be very careful in everything we say and do, for we are here on very serious business, and it would be well for you to look a little more seriously at life if you ever want to make anything worthwhile of your existence. And now, once more, do you know what you are to do?" "Yes, sir," said Karl, now quite grave. "I am to clean off all traces of the nightly expedition, to lock up the clothes you wore last night, and then to look about the neighborhood and talk with people about the occurrences in the greenhouse. I am to take dinner at the inn in Inzersdorf, and need not return here, today at least, until about 4 o'clock. Good. And one more thing. I am not so much interested, not as much as I was yesterday, in very large men or in men of the working class." "I thought so," said Karl quickly. Muller looked up quickly. "Why did you think that?" "Because the man who shot at you yesterday—" Muller started to interrupt, then concluded that he wouldn't. Karl needn't know everything. "Is not an ordinary working man." "And why do you think that?" "From the way he spoke." "You heard him speak?" "Yes. As he ran past me, I heard him say, not very loud though, 'Devilish adventure this.' That was all I heard." "And you didn't tell me that before now? I thought you were an intelligent man." "Should I have told you right away?" Yes, of course. That's most important. You are to tell me everything you see or hear at once. You are to tell me if you hear a fly hum, and think it could be of any use to me in my work." Muller's sentence ended in a smile, in which Karl joined. "And one more thing," continued the detective. "You are to take an interest in men's gloves of dark reddish-brown leather, and you must still watch men of over-middle height who wear long cloaks with hoods." Karl repeated every sentence until he was sure that he understood, and then in answer to Muller's question, replied that he had quite enough money for the day's expedition. "Very well, then. You need not be too careful of the money. But don't go ahead too fast. It may be necessary that you should invite the one or the other to have a glass with you. Most people talk more easily when drinking. And be careful to emphasize the fact that you know nothing more of me than that I am the landed proprietor Hartmann from Poland, that I am here to study brickmaking, and that you entered my service in Vienna." "Thank fortune, that's the truth," said Karl warmly. Muller answered with a friendly smile. "That's all right," he said cordially. "Keep straight, and that will be enough to show your gratitude for the little I've done for you, and for your mother's great love." Muller left the garden through the little door, and as he walked along his thoughts were still busy with the unknown. "So he talks High German, does he? I was right then, he is no working man. A devilish adventure, you say, my friend? It may be that it will prove devilish for you. It was a lucky thing he had no idea who it was that was after him, for if he discovers me before I discover him, my life will hang on a thread, or on a black cord, rather." Muller walked along with his eyes on the ground. Suddenly he stopped and bent to examine the moist earth. He was at the corner of the wall where the lane led into a wider street. The soft ground was covered with tracks of wagon wheels, horses' hooves, and human footprints. Among them was a trail of enormous feet of unusual shape. Muller recognized them as the same footprints he had seen that night in the Urlock garden. "So he followed us after all," murmured the detective, and the discovery did not contribute to his ease of mind. End of Chapter 8, Part 2. Chapter 9 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Muller visits Eva Geiringer. Muller's intention was to utilize this day in searching for Eva. He went to his own house first to ask Mrs. Tunner whether she knew anything that would aid him in this matter, as well as in the mystery of the missing 20,000 crowns. It certainly was strange that the miserly old man who, as Dr. Maximoff said, wept in emotion at his own generosity when he gave a beggar a copper piece, should have sent this Eva 20 crowns every month. His heart had opened to her, it seemed. Muller wanted to see this Eva personally to find out whether the larger sum, the 20,000 crowns, might have found their way to her also. Even the most miserly of elderly bachelors are generous sometimes, or have to be when it is a case of preserving their reputation. Mrs. Tunner was overjoyed to see her employer. He set her mind at rest at once by a good report as to her son's welfare and present conduct. Then he proceeded to the matter in hand. "Do you know anything about a woman by the name of Eva who stood in some relation to Urlock?" "No." "And do you not know that he sent money away the first of every month?" "I didn't know it happened every month, but once, about a year ago, I had to go to the post office with it myself and make out the money order." "Do you remember the name?" "No, I scarcely even looked at it and forgot it immediately. Mr. Urlock was sick, which gave me a great deal more work than usual, and just at that time I was particularly worried about Carl. I hadn't head for anything except my most necessary duties." "Too bad. Do you remember what month it was?" "Yes, I remember that. It was in October." "Well, it will be easy to find the address at the Inzersdorf post office. Don't worry about cooking dinner for me. I'm going right out again." "Oh, I just thought of something," said Mrs. Tunner. Muller had already started to leave the room, but he turned back and sat down again, looking inquiringly at her. "Mr. Urlock was quite well again before Christmas and asked me to go to the city with him one day," began the woman. "He said he wanted new underwear and he was afraid to buy it alone for fear he would be cheated. And from something that happened, I believe he had a secret errand, which was the main reason for his going to the city." "Tell me. It may be of importance." "The first thing I noticed was that he didn't take his own carriage to go to the city as usual. We went in the train instead and took a cab at the station. He left me at the store where I was to buy the underwear and told me that he had some errands in a distant part of the city. He would be back in an hour, and I was to wait for him in front of the shop. I finished my errand in about 20 minutes, and as the day was pleasant I took a little walk down the street. A block or two beyond I passed a bar-room, out of which a boy was bringing a glass of beer for a driver whose turnout stood in front of the door. By merest chance I glanced that way and recognized the cab and driver as the same that had brought us from the station, and with which Mr. Urlock had driven into the city. I was alarmed at this, and asked the cabman whether anything had happened to the gentleman. I thought Mr. Urlock might have been taken ill and gone in somewhere. But the cabman, who was already in a jovial mood, laughed at my question and answered, "Oh no, he didn't want to go across the city at all. As soon as you'd gone into the shop, he told me to drive to 5 Linden Street, and sent me up 3 flights with a package, while he stayed down and watched the horse. The package was for a lady up there." The man remembered the name and told it to me. The first name, I think, was Eva. The second, I know, was Geiringer. "Why are you so sure of that?" "Because I have relatives of the same name. That was why I remembered." "Eva Geiringer, number 5 Linden Street, 3rd floor." Muller wrote it down in his notebook. "Let us hope it's the same Eva. Now tell me more. What happened after that?" "I waited in front of the shop, and Mr. Urlock arrived on time, walking from the direction in which he had driven off before. He said he had just dismissed his cab, as he thought the little walk would do him good. So we went on foot for a little way, and then Mr. Urlock looked at his watch and said we would have to take a cab or we would miss the train. As we drove to the station, he was most unusually talkative, telling me all sorts of things he had done in the quarter of the town in which he was supposed to have been. I wondered at all this secrecy, because he was certainly his own master to do whatever he liked." "Was it a large package?" asked Muller. Mrs. Tunner did not think it was, because she had not noticed her companion carrying anything. The package must have been in his coat pocket. An hour later, Muller's carriage stood before the house in Linden Street, and he himself mounted the stairs to the third floor. On one of the many doors on this landing he saw the name of the woman he sought. He knocked at the door, and it was opened by an elderly woman, poorly but neatly clad. Muller inquired whether Miss Geiringer was at home. The woman smiled sadly and answered, "Oh, yes, she is at home." "May I speak to her?" he asked again. And again the woman answered, with sadness in her face and voice, "Yes, you can see her today." "Evidently the young lady is not always in the mood to receive visitors," thought Muller, as he entered the small, dark vestibule. The whole look of the place was totally different from what he expected, and when the woman went off to announce him, he looked about carefully. Signs of poverty were everywhere, but poverty combined with exquisite neatness and the ability to make the best of every little thing. The tiny little kitchen into which the vestibule opened was bright and cheery, and as well as the hall, was spotlessly clean. "Will you please come in, sir?" said the woman, returning and holding the door open. Muller entered a small, sunny room, furnished with the greatest possible simplicity, but cozy and homelike in spite of it. In front of the window was a large table, and beside it a great soft armchair. In the chair sat a thin, faded little woman, whose face seemed shrunken with its many wrinkles. Only the great gray eyes still showed signs of life and traces of former prettiness. "You are Miss Geiringer?" asked Muller, bowing. "I see you are not feeling well today, and I'm afraid I have disturbed you. Shall I not come some other time?" "I have not been well for 30 years, sir," answered the lady, with a gentle smile in which was a hint of roguishness, "and I hardly think you will care to wait until I am well again. So if there's anything that you have to say to me, Mr. "My name is Muller." "Then will you please take a seat, Mr. Muller, and tell me what it is?" The other woman brought up a second chair to the table, and Muller sat down in it. On the table were heaps of materials and instruments for making artificial flowers. Miss Geiringer laid aside the rose she had just finished, and folded her delicately shaped hands wearily in her lap. The other woman left the room. Muller was still dazed from the unexpected adventure. The Eva he had thought to find was something very different. Without knowing why, he had half expected to see a pretty young woman, possibly of doubtful reputation, and now he found himself sitting opposite an elderly invalid of the utmost respectability. He pulled himself together, readjusted himself to his surroundings, and explained the reason for his visit. He introduced himself as a friend of Leopold Urlach, and asked permission to put several important questions to the lady. The mention of Urlach's name threw Miss Geiringer into considerable excitement. "Oh, don't they know anything about him yet?" she exclaimed, clasping her hands. "Is he dead? Has he been murdered?" "You know, then?" asked Muller. She nodded. "I saw it in the papers a kind neighbor brought me," she said. "I know that Mr. Urlach, has disappeared most inexplicably from his house, or has been taken away from there." "Leo, that sounds rather intimate," thought Muller, "and quite different from the formality of her letters." But what he said aloud was, "Mr. Urlach has not yet been found, but this conversation is fatiguing you. Is there anything I can do for you?" "No, thank you," she murmured, straightening up again in her cushions. "I must try and control myself. You think there is anything I can tell you about Mr. Urlach?" "Yes, I think there is." "You mean something that has to do with his disappearance?" "Possibly. From letters that were found in his desk, we discovered that he corresponded with you." "They found my letters? Only my letters of thanks? Or should he still have kept the others?" A delicate rose flush illumined the faded cheeks, and a soft smile curved the pale lips. Muller saw during this smile that the fragile invalid still had very beautiful teeth. He answered gently, "The only letters that were found were those dated during the past year. There were a number of bundles of older letters there, but they were not examined." Miss Geringer's face was pale and still as before. "He sent me 20 crowns each month since August of the previous year," she said softly. "It was an alms, but it came with a few kind words each time, and I was obliged to accept it, for I can do very little work now, and we would have gone hungry many a day but for that." Her voice trembled, and she put her hand to her eyes. Then she continued in growing excitement. "My sister sews for a large shop, and rents the best room in our flat. I, as you see, make these flowers. We manage to get along somehow, but if we have to pay the doctor and the apothecary, it goes hard with us. I have been helpless for many years, and I know that of course I could find a place in the home for incurables, but I shudder at the thought, and my sister knows what it would mean to me to have to go there. She is too good to send me to such a place, although people tell her that she is foolish to have to work so hard just to keep me here. Is it not my duty, therefore, to accept this charity, which makes things a little easier for her? Dear lady, please don't excite yourself. I'm afraid it will be bad for you, said Muller sympathetically. Why should you not take the help that was offered you? We were only surprised that Erlach should have been so charitable. How did it happen that he opened his heart to you, and you alone? The old lady wiped the tears from her eyes and said in a firmer tone, Oh, yes, you do not know then in what relation we stood to one another. I was engaged to him 30 years ago. Ah, indeed, and yet they say that there was no woman in his life? I am telling you the truth, and have letters to prove it. I am still, as you see, wearing the ring he gave me in an unforgettable hour. Erlach was then a warm-hearted, sincere man, though he changed sadly later. I was poor. He found a richer and more beautiful woman who claimed his interest. When I saw that his heart turned to her, I broke our engagement myself. But he did not marry the other woman? No, said Miss Geiringer with a bitter smile. He was ready to marry her, but she found someone else who had more money than he, and whom she liked better. He came back to me then, but I would not have him. We were both sentimental in those days, though, and we did not give back our letters nor the rings we had exchanged. And so, you see, I'm old-fashioned enough to still keep his letters. But they won't do you any good in your investigation, for the Erlach who wrote those letters is long since dead. But how do you know that, if you haven't seen him for so long? I heard indirectly through people who live in his neighborhood that he had become hard and narrow-minded, making no friends and seeking none. Yes, that seems to have been the case. In the same way, without any desire of mine, news of our situation came to his ears, and he has been sending me this money ever since. She sat staring out into the room, her hands pressed close together, and great tears rolling unhindered down her cheeks. Muller understood now why her letters of thanks had been so cold and formal. It must have been very hard for her to take this money from the man whose wife she was to have been. But she had had to take it, for hunger is painful, and still more terrible was her dread of the home for incurables with all its surroundings of hopeless misery. And Erlach's pettiness of heart and mind was shown clearly by this meager gift, which out of his plenty he had sent to the woman he once had loved. Probably he wept at his own generosity every time he sent the money, thought Muller, a feeling of utter contempt in his heart for the man in whose interest he was busying himself. He felt nothing but sincerest pity for Miss Geiringer. He could understand what her life had been the last 30 years, in sickness and poverty. His face showed his feelings so clearly that the invalid's great soft eyes grew bright again, and she held out her frail little hand to him. "What will you think of me?" she said. "Here you come to me, a total stranger, and in less than half an hour I have told you things that very few know." "We're like steam engines, dear lady," replied Muller with a smile of encouragement. "We have to open the valves sometimes, you know. Need I assure you of my sympathy for you?" "No, I think I can feel it without words. Your visit is an oasis of brightness in the dreary loneliness of my life. I am only sorry for the sad reason of it, and I am sorry that I have so little to tell you that would be of any good for the investigation." "Erlach has never been here?" "No. It was my wish that he should never come. Even the most unfortunate of us has still a touch of vanity left, and I could not bear the thought that he should see me as I am now." "Then I have annoyed you quite uselessly?" said Muller, rising from his chair. Fraulein Geiringer straightened up. "Oh, I have thought of something," she said. "He sent me an extra present last Christmas. It was a reminder of old times, and therefore very dear to me. He had remembered that in those days I was particularly fond of miniatures. Also, he remembered that in those days I was said to look something like the Emperor Josephine, with the exception of my eyes." "And of your teeth," said Muller, smiling. "The Empress is said to have had very bad teeth, you know." Miss Geiringer flushed again, but she continued. "When we were engaged, Erlach showed me a charming little miniature of the Empress and one of Napoleon. He had bought them from the collection of a French nobleman. They are pretty pictures and oddly framed. Last Christmas he sent me the picture of the Empress and a silk scarf of antique design. There was a letter with the present. I will show them all to you." She touched a little bell on her desk, and when her sister came in, Eva caught at her hand and said, "Here, Mr. Muller, is the best sister that ever lived. She has kept me with her and made a home for me in spite of everything. I am afraid now that I will have to go to the asylum after all." "Dear little stupid," said the other woman, touching the invalid's hair gently. Then turning to Muller with a look of distrust, she continued, "Do you come from there? I know Eva's been writing to the asylum without letting me know, but I tell you now she shall not go. She's to stay here with me. I'll make it possible somehow." "No, indeed," said Muller with a friendly smile into the eyes of the agitated woman. "Miss Eva shall stay right on here, and I have a feeling that things will be a little easier for you now. But I must be going home. May I see the presents?" Eva opened the box her sister brought out. In it lay a carefully folded silk scarf, the miniature, and a letter. The picture represented Josephine Beauharnais in winter outdoor dress. The frame was odd and unusual. It was made of pale gold with an imperial eagle at the top. On its inner side a circle of tiny pale crystal points like icicles surrounded the painting. It was not altogether attractive. The only reason for it was possibly the suitability of these icicles to the winter garments worn by the Empress. Muller laid down the picture again and took the letter which Eva handed him. "My dear Eva, I hope the possession of this picture which I have always admired for your sake will please you. Please accept it with this scarf which was once worn by the Empress. As you see, I have not yet forgotten those years of our youth which brought us together. It was your wish that we should both remain alone. Was it right? I have forgiven. Your Leopold." Muller handed the letter back silently. As Eva laid it into the box again, a tear fell unnoticed upon the paper. "May I come back again if I have anything of importance to tell you?" asked the detective. Both women assented eagerly. He left them, bearing with him the impression that he had just made the acquaintance of two unusual natures. It was a compensation for the fact that his visit had, as he believed, brought him nothing that could be of value to him in his work. Mrs. Tunner had dinner ready for him when he returned. He told her that he had found Eva and that it was the right Eva. "Did you know that Erlach possessed two valuable miniatures representing Napoleon and Josephine?" "Yes, indeed. I know the pictures well. One of them is still in Mr. Erlach's cabinet." "I didn't notice it when I was there." "It's the picture of Napoleon." "Yes, it must be, for its companion has not been there for some months." "No, I know that. When I noticed it was missing, I imagined it must have been in the package that Mr. Erlach sent to Miss Geiringer." "It was. She showed it to me. They are charming pictures." "I was admiring the picture of Napoleon a couple of days before Mr. Erlach's disappearance," continued Mrs. Tunner. "We were working together at cleaning the various valuable curiosities in the glass cabinet in the sitting room. I remember the picture particularly and his speaking about it." Muller nodded with friendly indifference, his thoughts elsewhere. "Now, can you please tell me the names of all the visitors whom you have ever seen in Erlach's house?" he began. She was surprised at the question, but too sensible to waste words. She thought a moment and mentioned several names, all of which he wrote down in his book after asking various questions about each. From what she told him, Muller saw that Erlach had lived very quietly, and that few friends or acquaintances came to his house. He had heard this also from the missing man's nephew, from the gardener Till, and from Plone. Till had told him that Erlach's last visitor was the representative of an insurance company. The man had not entered the house, however, for Erlach spoke to him in the garden only for a few moments, and then Till had shown him out again. This was on the 6th of September. Mrs. Tunner, who had been indoors at the time, knew nothing of this last visitor. The latest person to enter the house before the disappearance, as far as she knew, was Dr. Maximoff. The Russian had been there on the 2nd or 3rd of September in the afternoon and had played chess with Mr. Erlach. The following day, Erlach returned the visit and spent the afternoon at Rose Cottage. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Columbus and the Egg. Muller returned to Inzersdorf about 5 o'clock that afternoon. He did a number of errands in Vienna, and among other things that he brought back with him was something to ensure his own safety. Years before, business had taken him to Marseille, and in an antiquary shop there he had found a sleeveless vest of fine steel mesh. It was a close metal net of finest workmanship and covered the entire torso. Twice, when out on dangerous errands, Muller had worn this vest as protection under his coat, and it had served him well. From the moment that he had seen the huge footprints in the soft earth outside the garden wall, so near to his own habitation, he had thought of this vest. For he knew by the traces that the man he had surprised in the greenhouse was on his trail, might possibly know who he was. The enormous footprints told him also that the nightly visitor to the Urlock mansion was the unknown who had committed the other crimes in the neighborhood, was the man with the black cord. The same huge footprints were found in the opened villa and around the spot where the more serious attack on the cattle dealer had taken place. This man was worth considering as a serious opponent. The veteran detective was sure of that, although he was not given to taking seriously any hint of danger to himself. Muller felt also that it lay in his own interest to push the matter through as quickly as possible. But it was not easy, for he still did not know in which direction to make the advance. He still did not know where to look for the man of whom he had already made an enemy. His own position was a dangerous one, and Carl Tunner was in danger too, for if this unscrupulous rascal realized that Mr. Hartmann was a detective, he might easily imagine Mr. Hartmann's servant to be of the same calling. Muller decided that he would send Carl away to a safer place. "Anything new?" he asked the young man as the latter came to take his hat and overcoat. Tunner shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know whether something I saw today when I went out is still unknown to you," he began. "You mean the big footprints outside the wall?" asked Muller. "Yes, but I thought you'd probably seen them yourself." "And did you think anything else?" "Well, I thought, sir, that you had better take double care not to meet this man again. He might shoot with better luck next time." "You're right, partly right. But I may as well tell you it wasn't he who fired. It was I. Unfortunately, I didn't hit him. It was courageous in you to come to my help, although I'm afraid it rather interfered with the result of my investigation." "Oh dear, why didn't I stay where I was?" said Carl. "I'm afraid I only put you into greater danger." "Oh, no, I'm not so sure about that," said Muller kindly. "Only I'm sorry that I shall have to send you away now, because I might have found you useful for many things." Carl's eyes opened wide in alarm. "You're going to send me away? Oh, why? Oh, please forgive me for my stupidity. Don't send me away. I won't go. I'll stay somewhere near you, for it's my fault that you are in danger now." "And how about you? Do you think this murderer will spare you either, now that he knows you belong to me?" Carl's face paled. The thought had not occurred to him. Then he said in a lower tone, "Is that the reason you're sending me away?" Muller nodded. The young man's fine eyes flashed fire. "I shan't go," he cried. "I'm not afraid, and if anything did happen, what would it matter about me?" Muller held out his hand. "Very well, then, we'll fight together," he said. "But you must not go unarmed now. Do you know how to use a revolver?" "Oh, yes." Muller opened his trunk, took out a pistol, and handed it to Carl with a box of ammunition. "It's a 6-shooter and every chamber loaded," he said. "Of course you understand that you're only to use it in extreme need. And now that's settled. But you look as if you wanted to ask a question. Well, what is it?" Muller sat down comfortably, lit a cigar, and offered Carl one. "You said last night the man was partly disguised," began young Tunner timidly. "All I could see was that he had a hood drawn over his head." "Quite right, but you only saw him in the darkness. I saw him for a moment in the light of my lantern. His cloak was brownish. I don't know how long it was, because the light fell upon the upper part of his body only. The hood was stiff, much higher than they usually are, and fitted so close to the head that there wasn't a wrinkle in it. I did not see his face, but I knew from the look of the hood at the back that it must close altogether or partially in front. He is masked, therefore, and his hood is responsible for part of his unusual height. That's the reason why I told you that you need not bother about very tall men any more. His hood had one other peculiarity also." "What is it? Please tell me." "It was cut out over the ears. The man must be able to hear well. It may possibly have left his mouth free also. Or did his voice sound muffled?" "I don't think so, but I couldn't really tell." "You couldn't? Oh well, you'll learn in time. We can't expect to know everything all at once. Now tell me, what were you doing with yourself today?" Carl's report was explicit, but contained very little of value. He had been talking with the people of the village about the various mysterious occurrences but what he had heard were garbled, incoherent accounts. He met the gardener Till and invited him to drink. Fortunately, Till had never seen Carl, for the young man's few visits to his mother had taken place after nightfall, and she herself always let him in and out. He had quite a conversation with the gardener, chiefly about Mr. Urlock and his disappearance, but as far as he could see there was nothing of value in what he had heard. "He didn't tell me anything new," concluded Carl. "The man was most interested in the doors that were locked from the inside, and in the 3 underscored words in the book. Oh, yes, and he mentioned the fact that the candle had spattered so and was surprised that it hadn't set anything on fire, because there was a heavy wind that night and the burning candle was near the open window." "Why, what's the matter, Mr. Muller? Mr. Hartmann, I mean," said Carl hastily. Muller had jumped up from his chair and was pacing the room with long strides. Back and forth he went 2 or 3 times, then stopped in front of the astonished Carl and asked, "It was the last window he spoke of? The window near which the table stood? This window was half opened, he said?" "Yes, that was the window, but it wasn't half open." "How was it?" "The right pane of the outside window and the left one of the inside were open." "Oh, that was it," murmured Muller, and repeated once more, "Oh, that was it." A smile flashed across his quiet face, and he walked through the room once again. Then he stopped in front of one of the windows and stood for a long time looking out on the dreary stretch of country beyond, over towards the old trees of the Laxenburg Avenue to where, beyond them, the pointed dark roof of the greenhouse rose amid the foliage. It stood there quiet and defiant, as if daring the watcher to penetrate its secrets. And beyond it the sky was a colorless gray. Carl, further back in the room, stood looking at his employer with a growing awe and admiration. He was such a quiet, unassuming little man in mien and bearing, and yet how quickly he could make himself the master of any situation. Carl was learning much in these days, and he was changing rapidly from the superficial, pleasure-loving youth he had been. Finally, Muller turned back to the room, his face calm as ever. All trace of excitement into which the mention of the window had thrown him was gone. He went to the cupboard and took out a book. "Here's something to read," he said, handing it to Carl. "Did you bring in supplies for supper?" "Yes, sir." "Well, then, go out into your own room and make yourself comfortable. I shall be busy now for a while, and then I'm going over to the house." When Carl had left him, Muller sat down to another careful study of the official report of the first police visit to the Urlock house, also to a study of the ground plan of the mansion. Toward 7 o'clock he joined the Plone family at supper and spent a pleasant evening with them. "Will you take up your studies again tomorrow?" asked the manager when Hartmann finally rose to go. "Oh, indeed I must," was the answer, "because, you see, I ran away today, but I don't come to Vienna often, and I always have so much to do when I do come." "Well, the longer you stay with us, the better we will like it," said Mrs. Plone. Hartmann bent over her hand politely and then left the house. The next day he appeared in Bauer's office promptly at 10 o'clock. He was anxious to learn about the bookkeeping of the factory, about the rates of wages and the method of payment. All this information was given him with a pedantic thoroughness which made him wonder more and more at what Plone had told him about Bauer's sentimental proclivities. The bookkeeper, thorough though he was quite satisfied with the intelligent interest shown by his listener. No one except Carl Tunner knew that this ardent student of brickmaking had already passed several hours before the dawn in the greenhouse. Carl had stood at the window of the pavilion with an excellent field glass and watched every moving thing that came within the range of his vision. Finally he saw his master coming from the direction of the Urlock property and breathed relieved. Muller seemed in a very good humor and asked for a cup of tea. It had been Hartmann's wish that his own servant should make the morning tea or coffee for both of them in the pavilion, and Carl had proved himself quite a clever cook. It was a dainty tray before which Muller sat down early this morning. The detective was in an excellent humor, and he did not seem to mind the fact that the eggs were a little harder than he usually liked them. Carl was quite upset over his carelessness in the cooking. "Oh, never mind it," said Muller. "You see, I'm taking the second one already." He put it in his egg cup and was about to strike the top with his knife. Suddenly he changed his mind, took up the egg again, and asked, "Can you make an egg stand on its end?" Carl Tunner was astonished. He was reckless enough himself, but he was struck dumb with admiration at the man who could joke about trifles while he knew himself to be at the mercy of an unusually clever criminal. "Oh, yes," said the young man with a smile. "I can do that. It's easy enough. Just break the top of the shell, and the egg will stand upright without any trouble." "That's it exactly, my young friend," replied Muller merrily. "And you know also that Columbus was the first person to do this simple trick?" "Yes." "And do you know that that is why we speak about the egg of Columbus, when we mean that a clever brain, a brain such as the man we are looking for must have, manages to accomplish the most apparently difficult feat with the simplest methods?" "Yes, I've always understood that's what it meant." "Well, my young friend, there are several sorts of Columbus eggs," laughed Muller. "And now you can give me another cup of tea. It's unusually good this morning." End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11, Part 1, of The Man with the Black Cord, by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Muller visits Rose Cottage. Several days passed. It was already the 28th of September, and still no light had been brought into the darkness of the Urlock mystery. This, at least, was the opinion of the people of Inzersdorf, as well as of Lieutenant Urlock and his friend Commissioner Lair. But Karl, who saw Muller daily and hourly, felt that something of importance had been discovered. The veteran detective wore his armor vest every day, but in spite of the necessity for this precaution, he seemed in the best of spirits. He spent more time than before in the brick factory, and showed the greatest possible interest in everything connected with it. He had visited the cashier, Gebhardt, in his office, and had drawn out an invitation from the latter to accompany him to his private rooms, by means of a few casual remarks. As they passed through the halls on this occasion, Gebhardt pointed to another door with the words, "That's where my colleague Bauer lives." Muller did not need the explanation, for he had already seen the visiting card tacked on the door. Several of the bachelor officials and clerks of the factory were domiciled in one wing of the office building, and the wing itself was connected with the manager's dwelling house by a covered walk. Muller led the conversation around to the subject of the other clerks, with particular interest in Bauer. Gebhardt, as well as all others who came in contact with him, was obliged to admire Bauer's intelligence and capacity for work, but he too shared the personal antipathy for the man that everyone else felt. Even the villagers did not like him, and the jovial innkeeper confessed to Gebhardt once that only a stern sense of the business advantage of it enabled him to be as cordial to Bauer as to his other patrons. His pretty little wife was open in her dislike of the Hamburger, as the villagers called Bauer because of the fact that he had lived for several years in North Germany and was fond of using expressions and words of that locality. She justified her feelings by the fact that Bauer added an inclination to run after any pretty woman to his other disagreeable qualities. That is, a woman counts such conduct on the part of a man as disagreeable, usually only when the man is not attractive. On his first visit to Gebhardt's room, the cashier showed him the bit of black cord which he had found there the day after the attack. It was a piece of black horsehair lariat, identical with the bit Muller had found twisted in the carving of Urlock's ebony bed. Early one bright afternoon, the detective set out to pay his promised call on Dr. Maximoff. The owner of Rose Cottage had evidently seen him coming, for he stood on the threshold, his hands cordially outstretched in welcome. As they walked through the wide hall, little Sonia ran to meet them, for she had already developed a great fondness for Mr. Hartmann on her various visits to the Plone house. Maximoff introduced to his guest the dignified elderly lady who took charge of his household and his little girl, and praised her patience with him in spite of what he called his attacks of violent anger. Mrs. Schober smiled in appreciation of the doctor's self-accusation and assured Mr. Hartmann that one could not wish for a more agreeable employer. "Shall I send tea up to your room?" she asked. "Please do," said Maximoff cheerily, running his arm through that of his guest. "I want you to see my sanctum, the room in which I have collected about me everything that gives me inspiration, that enables my soul to lift itself out of the prose of everyday existence. And yet our lives have driven such deep roots into this everyday existence that it gives them their chief color," said Hartmann. "Yes, you are right," replied the Russian, "and yet you are wrong, too. One can carve out a life for oneself alone, apart from the other, and it is this secret life that makes the other endurable." "Papa, you're going to show Mr. Hartmann your rings, aren't you?" asked Sonia. "Mimi told me that he liked Aunt Anna's old jewelry so much. Didn't you?" she said, snuggling up to the guest with an air of childish importance. "Yes, indeed I did, my dear little girl. and I want to see everything that is interesting and strange." "All right, baby, we'll show Mr. Hartmann all our treasures," said the doctor. "But you run along now and help Mrs. Schober decorate the tea table." "Oh, you are expecting guests?" "The very dearest guests who could come to me, and I include you among them. My betrothed is coming with her relatives." "But hadn't I better go away?" "Nonsense, you mustn't think of it for a moment. We have all grown so fond of you, and they will be as glad to see you here as they are to greet you in their own house. You have finished your work for the day, I know, and you must surely stay and be one of the party." "Really, I hadn't an idea that they were coming," continued Hartmann apologetically. "I had letters to write, and they kindly sent my dinner for me out to my own room. I have not seen the ladies at all today, and I saw Mr. Plone only for a moment." "All the more reason why you should stay and see them now," replied Maximoff, pressing his guest's hand warmly. "And here, now you are about to enter my favorite room." They stood on the threshold of a large apartment, furnished in dark colors, but with great richness and dignity. Heavy, tall bookcases and cabinets in dark wood lined the walls. Behind the glass doors were rows of heavy tomes and a number of scientific instruments. What wall space was still left free was hung with costly rugs, on which were placed rare and equally costly weapons of various countries. Between the two windows of the room stood an enormous flat-topped desk, covered with books and papers. "Really, this is delightful," said the guest as his eyes wandered about the attractive room. "I can indeed imagine that it is pleasant to work here, and to forget the everyday worries. What a stunning cabinet! That is as handsome a late Empire piece as I have seen." Still speaking, Hartmann went forward to the corner where the round front cabinet stood. "Ah, there you see, Sonia. We don't need to show our friend the way," laughed Maximoff. "He finds out our chiefest treasures at a glance." "It was impolite of me, wasn't it?" remarked Hartmann, pausing where he stood. "I ought to be punished. No, don't show me your rings now. I must learn to wait patiently. Don't you think so, Sonia? One ought to learn to be patient." Sonia was anxious to lead him to the cabinet, but he resisted and began the tour of the bookcases. "You are particularly interested in the subject of mental alienation, I see," he said as he read through the titles. "That is my specialty," replied the doctor. "The human soul interests me far more than the human body." "That's because your body is so healthy," said Hartmann with a smile. "If you knew what it was to be physically ill, you'd find the study of the body more interesting than you do now. However, my argument doesn't hold water, for your soul seems to me to be as healthy as your body. I have seldom met a man who impressed me as so strong and sane and well-proportioned in character as you are." "You flatter me." "Not at all. I am merely expressing my opinion. From our pleasant evenings in the Plone household, I have learned to know you as a delightful conversationalist and a good card player. Now I see on your desk the fat manuscript of what is doubtless a scientific work. I know your fondness for flowers and that you supervise your own garden, also that you are your little girl's teacher. I have heard of your charities from many of those whom you have helped hereabouts. You must let me tell you that I consider you a very remarkable man, all that the highly cultivated, civilized man ought to be, but is not except in the most unusual cases." "In the most unusual cases," repeated Maximoff, with a gaze out into space that seemed to forget the presence of his guest. "Ah, I see you have Pitaval also, and a number more works on criminal jurisprudence. Are you particularly interested in that line of study, too?" "Why, yes, very much so." Maximoff nodded, smiling. "Pitaval, for instance, has given very important contributions on the subject of psychology. Every criminal case interests me because almost every one shows the lack of proportion in the mental makeup of most human beings. But here comes the samovar," he interrupted himself. "Now for the lighter things of life. Do the honors, Sonia, darling, and then run and help Mrs. Schober, because if you don't, the flowers won't be nearly as prettily arranged." The little girl busied herself about the tea table, arranging the cups and saucers, ready to hand, lit the lamp under the kettle, then gave her father a hearty kiss and ran out of the room. "You are a happy man, indeed," said Maximoff's guest, looking after the charming child. "Yes, yes, indeed. Is she not a treasure? And I am happy now, but there have been hours in my life when I cursed this existence, and such hours may come again." He sighed deeply. "Now, that is your national melancholy again," said Muller sympathetically. "Is it anything you fear on Sonia's account?" "Have you noticed anything particular about the child?" "Only that she is unusually pretty." "Did you not notice how bright her eyes are and how unnaturally brilliant her skin?" "Well, what of that?" "She is the image of her mother, in that as in other ways. Come, I will show you." He led the way into the next room and halted before a life-size portrait draped in crepe of a beautiful woman of fragile, delicate appearance. Muller looked at the portrait, then spoke with a trembling in his voice. "Yes, yes, indeed. Sonia bids fair to be as beautiful as her mother was." To himself he thought, "Is the child as delicate also, and will she too die early?" And he understood the sadness in the eyes of the handsome man who stood looking up at the picture. "As beautiful, yes, and as frail," murmured Maximoff, holding his hands to his eyes. Then he turned quickly and went out of the room, Muller following him more slowly. When he caught up with his host, the latter was already pouring out the tea. "I don't think that I believe in the theory of heredity as strongly as you do," said the guest casually, as he took his cup. "I believe that it is possible to work against the development of an inherited trait, either mental or physical, and sometimes even to exterminate it entirely." "Do you really think so, dear friend? Do you really think so?" exclaimed the doctor warmly. His face flushed and his eyes gleamed, but the quiet poise of his guest seemed to calm him. He drank his tea in silence for a few moments. Then he began again. "The book I am writing concerns itself with this very theory of heredity, and I will confess to you that what you have just said is my own standpoint. I believe that one can fight inherited tendencies and destroy them completely." Again, the excitement mastered him. "We must destroy them in whatever way we can, but it is easy enough, and therefore I don't believe in the power of heredity any more than you do. But you're not drinking your tea, isn't it to your taste?" Mr. Hartmann hastened to assure his host that the beverage was in every way satisfactory. He finished his cup and lit one of the tiny cigarettes that lay in a silver dish on the tray. Maximoff began to smoke also and started a new subject of conversation. With no attempt at transition, he began to talk of the transmigration of souls. He handled this theme with brilliant originality, and his guests gained the impression that the eccentric Russian had occupied himself intensely with the subject, and that he believed in the theory absolutely. The interesting metaphysical conversation was interrupted, however, by the entrance of the Plone family, and the talk became lighter. As the weather was so favorable, the company adjourned to the garden after having had their tea, and Mrs. Plone and the children led Mr. Hartmann about among the flower beds, showing him the wonders that Maximoff had wrought since he became master of the property. The doctor's garden was not very large, but was so skillfully planned that it seemed much greater in size than it really was. Artistic groups of trees and shrubs were placed about in such a way as to show the smooth stretches of lawn to greater advantage. Gravelled paths twisted in and out among the screening bushes, giving the impression that one might walk some distance before coming out into the open again. Mrs. Plone and Hartmann, the children dancing about them, followed one of these paths in its various windings down towards the lower end of the garden. They passed a round stretch of lawn, in the midst of which was a circle of carefully tended box, surrounding a small fir tree. "There, Aunt Anna," said Sonia, catching Mrs. Plone's hand. "There's something new, and Papa made it all himself without any help from the gardener. And he's done ever so many things in the conservatory without the gardener, too. Anyway, the gardener hasn't been here for some time." "Then you don't have a gardener regularly for all this work?" asked Hartmann. Sonia explained that they did have a gardener formerly, but that he had been dismissed for disobedience during the month of August, and that Papa found he could get along just as well alone. Then the children led the party into the conservatories, where there was so much to see that they spent quite some time there. Plone himself sat in a comfortable chair on the veranda, reading the evening paper. Maximoff and his betrothed strolled up and down in front of the house, arm in arm. They were talking of the various alterations they should make in their home once they were married. Suzanne Plone was an attractive, warm-hearted girl, but her nature was too thoroughly well poised to be either sentimental or passionate. Her calmness made an excellent and wholesome foil for the brilliant, easily excited character of the man beside her. "You mustn't look at me like that, Sergius," she said gently, as she caught the hot glance of his dark eyes resting on her. "I am afraid of you when you look like that. I am afraid of you sometimes anyway. Afraid of your passionate nature, and I know you'll laugh at me now. I am afraid of your tremendous physical strength." "Oh, dearest, dearest," he murmured, drawing her to him in spite of her resistance. "You mustn't do that either," she pleaded. "Not at all? Never? he whispered in her ear. She blushed with an embarrassed smile. "You foolish man," she said. "But now, anyway, you must walk beside me quietly and quite demurely." "Are you really afraid of me?" he asked with a new tone of anxiety in his voice. She nodded. "Yes, I am, sometimes. It made me shiver to see you break that heavy oak stick the other day, but I know that very strong men have to do that sort of thing occasionally to use up their excess of vigor." "Well then, what's the matter?" "Oh, I don't mean that, but at the time the thought came over me, he could break me in two like that, and I shuddered to my very heart. I don't know why. Now don't look so gloomy, dear Sergius. Don't I know how good and how faithful your heart is? Another woman might feel hurt to see that beautiful picture still hanging upstairs there. I like to stand and look at it, for to me it gives an added proof of your power of affection. I like to realize that you cannot and will not forget the woman who first won your heart." "And it does not offend you? It does not hurt you?" he asked anxiously. Suzanne shook her head. "We will share your heart as sisters, your dear dead love and I," she replied tenderly, stroking from his brow the furrow her last words had drawn there. Then they joined the others, and an hour later the guests left Rose Cottage. Before his departure, Mr. Hartmann had given his solemn promise to return the following day and examine Maximov's pride, his collection of antique rings. When Muller retired to his pavilion that evening, he was convinced that Dr. Maximov was the other of the originals of whom Plön had spoken. But the Russian was so much a finished man of the world that his originality was scarcely perceptible outside of his own little kingdom, the home that expressed his rich personality so well. Muller felt surprised again at the thought that this busy and versatile man would even take time to do the actual manual labor in his garden. He knew him also as a philanthropist of astonishing liberality. The Plöns had told Hartmann early in his visit how generous Maximov was to people of the village. He had built a lodging house and a library for them, and every day 10 poor people were given dinners at his expense in the parish house. This afternoon, as they walked back to the manager's home, Plön told Hartmann that he had just heard, not from Maximov himself, but from a friend who was a physician in a Viennese hospital, that the Russian had given 40,000 crowns to endow 2 beds in the establishment. The only condition was that the name of the donator should not be mentioned. "Of course, I wouldn't let him see that I knew anything about it, and you must promise to do the same." Hartmann promised readily that he would not betray the secret. The veteran detective had taken a great liking to Maximov, and his flattering words when they were alone that afternoon had been only the expression of his sincere admiration. End of Chapter 11, Part 1. Chapter 11, Part 2 of The Man with the Black Cord by Auguste Groner, translated by Grace Isabel Colbron. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Muller visits Rose Cottage, Part 2. Next morning, Muller spent several hours with Bauer going over the works. The afternoon found him again in Rose Cottage. Some time was spent in the conservatories in admiration of the doctor's remarkable results in the culture of chrysanthemums. Then host and guest went into the house, Sonia running beside them. "Now you really must see my rings," said the Russian brightly. "Sonia, dear, you'll look after the tea, won't you?" The little girl ran out, and the 2 men, arm in arm, crossed the study and stood before the handsome cabinet which had already attracted Muller's attention. Maximov's manner was almost ceremonious as he turned the key in the lock. "What I have here is not only costly in material and workmanship," he said, "but it has its chief value in the association connected with each piece. Every one of my rings represents, as it were, a bit of world history, for each one of them was the property of a person of importance in the history of the world." While speaking, he drew out a drawer of the cabinet. It contained 4 ebony boxes with glass tops. They were lined with dark blue velvet, and the rings lay resting on little knobs. There were about 40 of them, a collection that was indeed of great value. Maximov pulled up a chair for his guest with the words, "You must sit down and examine these at your ease to thoroughly appreciate them." Muller settled back comfortably in the chair and examined each piece with great interest, while his host gave the necessary explanation. There was, for instance, a simply worked golden circlet set with a roughly cut diamond of considerable size, which had been worn by Peter the Great. A heavy ring set with many pearls of value had once adorned the hand of Anne Boleyn. A peculiarly carved ring of darkened silver had been the property of Count Wallenstein. Maximoff could tell the story of each piece in his collection, and could tell it so well that his listener's enjoyment of the curiosity was enhanced doubly. When the last of the rings had been studied and admired, Maximoff laid the boxes carefully back in the drawer. "I suppose, of course, you have documents to prove the truth of the history of this really remarkable collection?" asked Muller. "Oh, yes, indeed," said the doctor eagerly. "I'll show them to you at once." He fairly tore open the next drawer and took out a large portfolio which lay in it. At the same moment, Muller, looking at the open drawer, remarked, "Oh, I see you have all sorts of other beautiful things there. Miniatures, too. That's another expensive fad. Are you interested in that sort of thing?" "Very much." "Then I'll show you what I have. It isn't very much. I've been collecting miniatures only about a year or so." He took the case out of the drawer and held it so that his guest could look at the little pictures. There were only 7 of them, but each one a masterpiece in its way. One of them seemed to interest Muller greatly. He stared at it as if hypnotized, while Maximoff drew out and sorted the papers in the portfolio. A stereotyped smile curved Muller's lips, but the smile did not go deeper than the surface. His heart seemed to stand still, and the thoughts whirled through his brain in such a mad rush that he did not hear Maximoff's next remark. Finally, the detective realized that his host was speaking to him. "Why, you're quite lost in the study of my art treasures," said Maximoff with a little laugh. It was a bright and cheery little laugh, but a shiver, icy cold, ran down Muller's spine as he felt the other man's hand on his shoulder. "Which is it that so absorbs you?" continued the Russian. Muller rose slowly from his chair and pushed it back. He leaned lightly against the window frame, and his face was pale. But the eyes which met Maximoff's firmly were perfectly calm, and the tone of his voice was quiet and indifferent as he finally spoke. "The Napoleon interests me the most, I think. I've never seen him painted just this way before." "Yes, isn't it odd?" remarked Maximoff eagerly. "It isn't the great emperor we see here, the mighty general. It's just a private individual who feels as cold as we would when the thermometer drops down to 0. The picture interested me because of what I call its ironical conception of the subject, and I procured it recently with considerable difficulty." While the Russian was speaking, he held the little picture before him and looked at it, his eyes full of merriment. Another phase of his surprise, scarcely less than the first, filled the detective's mind. In spirit, he reviewed his visit to Miss Geiringer, and held again in his hand the picture of the Empress Josephine, undoubtedly the companion to this miniature of Napoleon. Then he heard Mrs. Tunner say again, "Mr. Urlock and I cleaned the picture of the Emperor 2 days before his disappearance." And again, "Dr. Maximoff was the last person to visit Mr. Urlock. He was in our house on the 3rd of September." And again, Muller seemed to hear Till's report, "An insurance agent came to the place on the 6th of September, but he did not enter the house." Like succeeding flashes of lightning, these sentences shot through the detective's head, bound together, as it were, by the bits of black cord and the enormous footprints that he had seen in the Urlock garden. Footprints which he had seen later in front of the wall surrounding the Plone pavilion, a proof that the man with the black cord had followed him there and knew who he was. And now he was here in the house of the most highly respected man in the neighborhood, stood opposite this cultivated and great-hearted man, and saw him smiling at the little picture of Napoleon, the picture which, as he said, he had recently procured with considerable difficulty, the picture which was in Urlock's possession up to 2 days before his disappearance, after which time no visitor had entered his house. Had Maximoff been there once more, without the knowledge of Mrs. Tunner or the Tills, and had he persuaded the old gentleman to sell him the picture? But Muller remembered that Maximoff himself had once mentioned that his last meeting with Urlock took place in the very first days of September, the afternoon that he had played chess in the greenhouse. This agreed with what Mrs. Tunner had said, but might it not have been a lie, after all? All these thoughts circled madly through Muller's head while he stood looking at the smiling Russian. What was the difficulty of which the other spoke? There are various ways of procuring a treasured masterpiece, he asked himself, his teeth set firmly, and a pitiless gleam rose in his eyes, while his hand involuntarily found its way to the pocket of his coat, in the depths of which was his little revolver. When a man finds himself unexpectedly in the lion's den, the feel of a weapon in his hand is very comforting. But was he in any danger here? Here as the guest of this delightfully amiable and quite harmlessly cordial Maximoff? It did not seem possible to the veteran detective. Still, every single move in this series of crimes had been carried out with a most unusual and unheard-of audacity, carried out in a way that could only have been done by a most unusual type of criminal. Muller found himself suddenly with a new clue, a new trail opening before him. A false one, perhaps? But however that might be, it was his duty to follow it up, unless he could prove that there was an identical miniature of Napoleon still in the cabinet in Erlach's study. If the picture was not in its place there, then he would have to follow up this new clue. In the course of his long and rich experience, he had learned that however utterly improbable a thing may seem, it may yet be a fact. The detective breathed deeply, and a peculiar gleam came into his eyes. A strange smile moved his lips. The stately, handsome host did not seem to notice it. His great dark eyes still rested merrily on the little picture of the shivering emperor, as he delicately breathed into the air rings of smoke from his tiny cigarette. "Do you see this, Mr. Hartmann?" he said cheerily. "The painter has even taken the liberty of putting a tiny touch of red on the imperial nose." He handed the picture to his guest. "Yes, really, so it is," answered the other, laughing, and added, "You said just now that you had considerable difficulty in obtaining possession of this picture. What was the trouble?" Muller smiled in harmless friendliness as he asked the question. Not a line of his face, not a quiver in his voice, betrayed the tenseness that held him for the last few moments. Maximoff was equally calm. In his usual witty manner, he began to tell the story of how he had found the miniature in the shop of an antiquary in Vienna, of how he had gone there again and again to try and buy just this one piece out of a Napoleon collection which the man wanted to sell altogether. It had cost Maximoff, so he said, many journeys and considerable money until he finally managed to get possession of this most interesting piece of the entire collection. The Russian did not spare a joke at the expense of his own obstinacy and his awakening collector's mania. His story was easily and naturally told, but when it came to an end, Muller noticed that Maximoff had not mentioned the name or the address of the antiquary in question. At this moment, a young serving-maid entered with a card on a silver tray. The girl was evidently untrained as yet, for she left the door open behind her, and Muller could see a man in the hall outside. A single glance at this visitor, and the detective turned to the window, almost burying himself in the heavy curtains that hung there. The gleam in his eye was perceptibly heightened. He kept his gaze on Maximoff, who, as he read the name on the card, lost his laughing indifference. His face flushed in anger, a deep fold ploughed itself between his brows, and his eyes shot fire. He was evidently in the grip of one of the sudden rages of which he himself had spoken. "You idiot! Don't you know enough to shut the door?" he cried to the girl, and then walked quickly to the now entering visitor. "You know your business. Nobody's safe from you, I suppose?" The stranger, an elegantly dressed gentleman, seemed to be somewhat offended at this reception, for his voice was sharp as he answered, "Dr. Maximoff, I should indeed know very little about my business, if it were not possible for me to follow up anyone who has once honored me with his confidence and his patronage. Why, I am—" He did not get any further, for on entering the room he had seen the figure of a man in the shadow of the heavy plush curtains at the window. He bowed lightly to this scarcely seen person, and Maximoff also turned to the window. "My dear Mr. Hartmann," said the doctor, "pray excuse me. I'm obliged to talk to this gentleman a few moments, but I will soon return to you." "You'd better lock up your treasures first," replied Hartmann from behind the handkerchief which he held to his face, as he was struggling with a fit of coughing. Maximoff motioned the stranger to enter the neighboring room and shut the door behind him. "These people are so aggressive," he said indignantly to Muller. "I went to see this man the other day to talk about some changes I want made in my house, a new addition I am desirous of building, and now he comes here without being sent for." "Well, I'll be off then," said Muller. "For as long as the man is here, you might as well have your talk with him without being hurried." "Are you really going?" "Yes, I must. But if you will permit it, I will come soon again." "Permit it? Why, I shall be delighted to see you here, delighted. I confess that I'm growing very fond of you. Is that really true? Haven't you noticed that I seem to enjoy your company? At least you have not avoided me, but seemed rather to seek me out. Then I may be equally frank, and tell you that I find myself taking a great liking to you. Why do you speak so low? It isn't necessary that your architect should know everything, is it? But now you must go to him. Good afternoon, Doctor. We will meet soon again, I hope. A few moments later, Muller was outside, walking along the dreary highroad. He looked at his watch, then changed his direction suddenly and walked rapidly towards the little railway station. He was just in time to spring into a train for Vienna. He found himself alone in the compartment. What was that man doing there? He asked half aloud. Then he burst out into a hearty laugh. Did he send for him to spy on the dwellers in the pavilion? But his sudden merriment did not last long. It gave way to the graver thoughts that absorbed him completely, that dazed him with their swing and rush. It is absolutely mysterious, incomprehensible. If it is he, why am I still alive? And if it is not he, why these two lies today? For I know that this Napoleon miniature is the one that belonged to Urlock. The manner of painting, even the odd frame, might be repeated on two pictures, but the peculiar pattern of the paper that is pasted over the back of this little masterpiece and of the picture of Josephine could hardly be repeated in a copy. Well, I'll know before nightfall whether there is a picture of Napoleon in Urlock's cabinet. But I very much fear that Maximov's story of how he got the picture was as much a lie as his assertion that his visitor was an architect. I am greatly afraid of it, thought the veteran detective, for I really and truly had begun to like the man. In the city, Muller went to his own home first. An hour and a half later, he entered the office of a well-known private detective agency. He was ushered into a cozily furnished little room, hardly larger than a good-sized closet. All the reception rooms of the establishment were on this order, for the customers who came here desired secrecy beyond everything else. Muller was well known to the attendants and was shown into the little room which adjoined the manager's private office. The manager may be here any moment, said the attendant who showed him in. Is there anything I can do for you until he comes? No, thank you, said Muller. I don't mind being alone, as I have a great deal to think over. There, I think he's in there now, said the attendant, listening towards the door of the private office. Muller rose and knocked at this door. As he passed a long mirror to reach it, he smiled at the reflection he saw there, the reflection of his own slender figure, for he had left all that made up Mr. Hartmann in his own home. Ah, good afternoon, my dear Mr. Muller, cried Manager Grang as Muller entered the room. Grang was engaged in hanging up his overcoat on a hat rack. He stopped just where he was, flung the coat over his arm, and came forward with his free hand outstretched. Deus ex machina, he exclaimed, evidently greatly pleased to see the old detective. And why? Asked Muller with a cheery laugh, as the other led him to a soft corner of the sofa and piled up the cushions invitingly. My, you're treating me as if I were Her Royal Highness, who was here on the 24th, he continued, leaning back in the corner. Grang walked over to the hat tree, hung up his coat, and now came back hastily. What do you know about the princess? He asked in astonishment, not altogether pleased. Muller pointed to the cigar box that stood on the table and remarked with a smile. Why don't you say as usual, help yourself, old man? Sure, help yourself, old man. Grang pushed the box over to Muller. But then you'll answer my question, won't you? Grang took a seat too, and his momentary displeasure was soon gone. In fact, he was glad that this Muller seemed to know everything. For the last 2 hours, Muller had been the principal figure in a scheme of his. The veteran detective took so much time to light his cigar that Grang decided it were better not to say anything about the princess and to talk to Muller about his own scheme. This was the gist of his first remark. As you like, replied the other. Well then, what sort of a scheme is it that you have woven around my worthy personality? Grang rose, went to a cupboard, and brought out a bottle of brandy and 2 glasses. We'll drink a glass first, to your very good health, he said. My health is excellent just at present, thank you, answered Muller. I'm very glad to hear it. Why, particularly? First for your sake, and then for my own. Nothing the matter with this brandy, said the guest as he sipped it slowly. But what does it matter to you how I am feeling? It awakens a hope. What hope? Grang looked at his guest carefully. You certainly look fine. Do you think so? Yes, I do. I noticed the difference, possibly, because it's 2 years since I saw you last. Yes, that was in Pegley, wasn't it? It was certainly awfully good of you to come over from Genoa just to see me. It was quite natural. I was living in hopes then, too. Concerning me, you didn't say anything about it. No, I didn't dare mention the subject. Mercy, I had no idea you were so shy. Well, you see, when one man wants to suggest a partnership to another, and the other begins the conversation by saying that he never intends to work again, it doesn't look very hopeful. I was having so much trouble with my liver just then. Is it all right now? You certainly look it. And you certainly look very enterprising today. I not only look enterprising, but just at present I feel very much so. And you feel like working again? Grang bent forward eagerly. Yes, I feel quite like working again. That's the reason I'm here today. Oh, that's fine. Then I may ask you something? Certainly, what is it? Would you be ready for a journey? Out of the country? To Russia. Muller drank his second glass of brandy slowly and carefully, weighing each drop of the amber liquid on his tongue as if he hadn't another thought in the world. The younger man waited until his impatience got the better of him. Well, my dear Muller, do answer. To Russia, you say, remarked the old detective indifferently. And what am I to do there? Grang shrugged his shoulders and answered with a slight embarrassment. I don't know. You don't know? No, my client is very distrustful. But he must have confided in you to some extent. He has told me only that he wants an independent, preferably unmarried, highly intelligent, and discreet detective to go on a journey to Russia with him. Is that all, and you're to find this treasure for him? Yes, that's it. He came here about it, and you haven't let him get out of your sight since then, have you? Muller, what do you know about it? I know that you were in Dr. Maximov's house this afternoon. Well, that beats all. You know your business. No one is safe from you, I suppose. These were the words with which he welcomed you. The devil! Now how the mischief did you know that? Are you omnipresent? No, I'm only in one place at one time. But the place I happened to be at that time was in the window of the study at Rose Cottage. Oh, then you were the man who stood there? You have hit it exactly. Incredible! And yet, I don't know, it's not so surprising. I had to tell the Russian that I hadn't the sort of man he wanted at liberty just now, and that he might have to wait some little time before I could send him the right person. So I suppose he may have heard of you and sent for you himself. That explains his anger at my coming. If he needed me, he wouldn't have considered it an intrusion. Still, I don't know then why he should have lied to me. Why didn't he tell me that he had the man he wanted instead of insisting that I was to find someone right away? That's what I don't understand. But I understand it. Then do tell me. Dr. Maximov does not know that I am a detective, and he must not know it for some time yet, said Muller, believing in his heart that what he had just said was a lie. So, you see, he couldn't very well engage me for this journey, and he had to trust to you further. Oh, that's it, is it? Have you been friends with him for some time? For several weeks now. I'm rather surprised that he should not have spoken of this journey to anybody. Would you be in a position to know if he did speak of it? Certainly. I see him very often in the presence of his best friends in that neighborhood. And you hadn't a suspicion that there was a secret in this man's life? There must be, judging from what he demands of me. No, I hadn't the faintest suspicion of it until today, answered Muller truthfully. Then he added, there are secrets, political secrets, in the lives of most Russians who live outside their own country. I suppose this is another one of the same kind. Probably. Anyway, he pays very well. He has promised me an unusually large commission for finding the man he wants, and the salary the latter will earn will be equally munificent. So I thought of you, Muller. That was kind of you, but you know that I haven't worked merely for money for some time now. Pardon me, that wasn't what I meant. I had thought of you, for it struck me that the case promised to be interesting. Interesting politically, probably, but I'm not interested in politics. No, I'm afraid you can't depend upon me here. I don't want to enter Maximov's service and thus lose him as a friend. Oh, confound it, complained Grang, and I thought it was my special good fortune that brought you to me today, because, to be honest with you, if you don't want to do it, I'll have to lose the good job. Oh, no, you won't. You can take this case. My dear Muller, what do you mean? Now, don't get excited. You'll get your commission and save the reputation of your house. I have a young friend, his name is George Munzer, who I think is just the man. I will be responsible for him, and you can recommend him to Maximoff without fear." "George Munzer? The name is quite new to me," said Grang. "Not to me," thought Muller, "for I had an uncle by that name." Then he said aloud, "There was a time, you know, when the name of Napoleon Bonaparte was new to most people. If I say that I'll be responsible for this young man, you needn't fear recommending him to anybody." "Oh, certainly, certainly," said Grang hastily. "When can you send him to me?" "In the course of the next 2 or 3 days. I think he is in Vienna now and at liberty." "Not for 2 or 3 days? Oh, dear." "What's the matter now? Are you in such a hurry?" "I'm not, but the Russian seems to be. By what he says, he'd like to start the man off tomorrow." "Oh, I don't believe a day or two will make such a difference." Muller rose slowly from his chair and continued. "Well, for your sake, I'll see if I can't find Munzer today. If he is free, you will have word by tomorrow morning." "Oh, thank you ever so much. That's really nice of you." Grang shook Muller's hand warmly, but not until the latter had taken up his hat did it occur to the manager of the establishment to inquire the reason for his guest's coming to him. "Why, you see," replied Muller with a show of candor, "I was greatly interested in knowing what you and Maximoff had to do with one another. That's the only reason I came." Then Muller left the office after another hearty handshake with the man from whom he had easily learned something which might be of value to him. He was very glad now to realize that Grang had not recognized the change in his figure, or had not noticed that Maximoff had addressed him by a strange name. For otherwise the really very clever manager of the private detective agency, who knew his business although he was in some respects a little too credulous, might have noticed that Muller was playing a part out in Inzersdorf. Quite satisfied with the result of his visit to the agency, the veteran detective stepped into a printer's shop, ordered some visiting cards, and sat down to wait for them. The cards were printed with the name George Munzer. Muller stayed in his own house only long enough to return to the outer contour and the apparel of Mr. Hartmann. His servant Conrad mounted the box of the carriage beside the coachman and drove out with him. The stars were already showing clear in the sky when they reached the secluded spot on the Black Moor where Muller usually let his carriage wait while he visited the Urlach house. He carried the keys with him in his pocket so as to be ready to go there whenever necessity required. Once in Urlach's study, he lit a candle and searched carefully in every corner of the cabinet where Urlach kept his curiosities. The miniature of Napoleon was not there, nor was it anywhere else in the room. When Muller was quite sure of this fact, he pressed his hands to his forehead a moment and sighed deeply. Then he went out, leaving the greenhouse to its undisturbed quiet again. Conrad had been doing sentry duty at the garden gate and reported that no one had passed anywhere within the range of his vision. Muller sent him back to the carriage with orders for the coachman to drive further up the street towards the brick factory. He himself walked towards the Plone house and let himself in unseen at the garden gate. Karl was waiting for him anxiously in the pavilion. "Shall I get supper ready for you?" he asked. "It's nearly 10 o'clock. I've had mine already." "No, my dear Tunner. I'll fix what I need for myself later. I want you now to listen carefully to what I have to say to you." "Yes, sir." "How many times do you think that Dr. Maximoff has seen you? Think it over carefully." Karl pondered a minute. "Not more than 3 times at most," he said decidedly. "Did he ever speak to you?" "No, and I don't believe he really ever saw me. The doctor is a little bit haughty. I don't think a servant really exists for him." "Possibly. I never noticed it myself." "I felt it, sir." "All the better then, for then he has never noticed you particularly. That's a very becoming beard you're wearing. Thus far I've had no objection to it, but now I'm afraid it's in the way." "I'll have it shaved off, sir," replied Karl willingly. Muller nodded. "Yes, have it taken off before 11 o'clock tomorrow morning." "It'll be gone by that time, sir." "Here are 300 crowns. Now let me see, you've been wearing a gray suit here, haven't you? Now you go and buy yourself a dark blue or a black suit and a heavy winter coat. Also, get anything else you may think you would need for a journey to Russia. It must all be done before 11 o'clock tomorrow." "You can depend upon me, sir." "Then from 11 o'clock you must stay at home." "Here?" "No, in my house in the city. We'll dine there tomorrow noon, and then I'll explain everything to you. Here are your visiting cards. You will need to use 2 of them tomorrow, so don't lose them, and don't forget what your name is." Karl threw a glance at the little pasteboards. Then my name is George Munzer? Yes, you are George Munzer, a private detective by profession. I'll tell you all the rest tomorrow. And now get ready to go back to town. You will find my carriage waiting for you by the railroad bridge. Good night, George Munzer. Good night, Mr. Hartmann. 10 minutes later, Muller heard a wagon driving slowly past the garden wall, the noise of the wheels dying away in the distance. He stood at the window for some time. He knew there was no danger in doing so, for the room behind him was in darkness. While his eyes wandered up to the gleaming star points in the blackness of the space above, his mind went over in review all he had experienced that eventful afternoon and evening. No, he murmured half aloud, there is no picture of Napoleon in Erlach's cabinet. Then after a little while, he added, with a deep sigh, and this Maximoff is such a really delightful and sympathetic personality. End of Chapter 11, Part 2.